My father passed away about 5 years ago, unexpectedly from a heart attack. To say it was hard on my mother and I is an understatement. Our old house in Knoxville just didn't feel like a home anymore. About a year later, Mum and I made plans to take ourselves and our elderly dog Ace on a move further south. We were relocating to a small town about a half hour from Atlanta. Just a few days before we were slated to move, however, I had one of the most vivid dreams I've ever experienced. All that was within my dream was my bedroom, a picture-perfect recreation of the real thing. I sometimes wonder if I was in some sort of sleep paralysis state when it occurred. To further add to the dream's realness, in the middle of the night, the streetlights right across the street would illuminate through my window, creating a light reflection on my wall. In my dream, as I lay there, staring at the same reflection, I saw an orb of smoke fade in from the shadows. Goosebumps chilled across my skin as I lay there, panicked and afraid to move a muscle. Suddenly, the orb of smoke stopped moving and steadily hung in the light's reflection, as if it was staring at me. Without warning, it spoke to me in my dead father's voice. "I'm sending someone to watch you," it said. Despite hearing my father's voice come from the orb, I was absolutely terrified of it. I didn't know why. I managed to squeak out a small reply. "What?" I whispered. The orb remained silent for a few moments, leaving an eerie silence in the voice's place. Just as quickly, it spoke to me one final time. "Damn. Black." I woke up almost instantaneously, gasping for breath. The nightmare had chilled me to my core. I didn't know exactly what to make of it, especially those two final words. I chalked it up to maybe my dad wishing us well on our move, but at the time, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was some kind of warning. Within the next couple of weeks, my mother and I had moved out of Knoxville and headed down south to Georgia. She had managed to find a quaint little house for us. With only one or two neighbors down a gravel road in the middle of the woods, it was a nice fit for us. Probably the best reliever of all of the stresses that came with the move, however, was our new neighbor's cat. She was a petite, older black cat that gravitated towards me almost instantly, and I treated her as if she was my own pet. I left a can of food out for her once or twice a week, and even if I didn't call out for her, when she saw me outside, she would always run up to me. She helped ease my tensions about moving to Knoxville, especially without Dad there with us. Less than a month into our new house, I awoke suddenly in the middle of the night to a faint coughing noise that sounded like it was coming from downstairs. One important thing to know is that our dog, Ace, has a collapsed trachea. He needs medicine to help calm the condition down, so I'm used to waking up in the middle of the night to give him his medicine. I walked downstairs from my bedroom to go and give it to him. But that's the thing, I couldn't find him anywhere in the house. He wasn't in his bed sleeping. He wasn't in the kitchen. He was nowhere to be found. I didn't check my mum's bedroom, however, as to avoid waking her up. Besides, I wouldn't have heard the coughing if he had been in there anyway, so I just let it be. That's when I heard the cough again, but it was coming from further away, as if from outside. I looked over at the side patio door leading out into the woodlands and realized I had forgotten to shut it. It was slightly ajar. Christ, I thought to myself, he got out. I immediately ran outside with a flashlight and started calling for my dog. "Ace! Ace!" I shouted into the neighboring trees. I heard another cough and shined my light in its direction. That time, the cough had echoed from down the gravel road. I swear, a path had never looked so terrifyingly desolate. But in that moment, I thought my dog was lost, so I chalked the fear of the gravel road down to new house jitters. I pressed onwards. "Ace, come on boy, home's this way buddy." That's when I heard it, the cough that I had been following, but this time it didn't sound like the dry cough I'd been hearing before. Instead, the cough had slowly morphed into a low growl. I shined my light towards the new sound. There, up ahead, stood a bright red fox in the middle of the path. For a moment, I figured it was some kind of sick fox which I had mistaken for my dog. The whole time, as I was processing what I was seeing, it stared directly at me. Its eyes glowed from the light of my flashlight. However, our stare broke when it tilted its head to the right. I looked down at what it was staring at, and there she was. Our neighbor's little black cat standing beside me. It was as if she had completely changed persona. She was no longer the happy, affectionate cat I had come to know. Instead, she had her back arched upright, every fiber of her hair standing at attention. The little cat uttered the lowest growl I have ever heard come out of a feline. I figured she was just scared of the fox, so I knelt down beside her, trying to coax her away. I didn't want the fox hurting her. No matter how many times I tried to coax her out of her fight mode, she wouldn't budge. Her stare remained unfazed. That's when I looked towards the direction of the fox once more. There wasn't a fox standing there anymore. Instead, in the exact same spot of that gravel road, there was a walking, rotting corpse of a roadkill coyote, slowly moving towards me. I took a step back, absolutely horrified of what I was seeing. Its jaw was hanging loose from its face. One of its eyes was stained red, and it wobbled back and forth as if it was desperately fighting pain. I rubbed my eyes out of disbelief, hoping I was imagining it, but it was still there when I opened my eyes. Despite the gruesome sight before us, our neighbor's black cat, in spite of how tiny she was, stood there and kept growling at the creature, holding her ground. Suddenly, the thing stopped. The creature had ceased its walking towards us. For a moment, it just stood there, glancing back and forth between myself and this little black cat that was trying to defend me. That's when I unmistakably heard this beast mutter 2 solemn words in a low, gravelly voice. Damn. Black. In a flash, the creature ran straight into the woods. I shined my flashlight in its direction, but it had completely vanished. Even the brush it had run through looked untouched. That's when the cat, still standing beside me, calmed herself down, almost as if nothing had happened. She rubbed herself up against my leg, returning to her normal, loving mood. Despite technically not being mine, I proceeded to scoop her up and run back to my house. Before heading upstairs with the little black cat snuggled up in my arms, I decided to poke my head into my mother's room. Laying on the floor, sound asleep, was Ace. He'd been in there the entire time. I quietly closed her door before bolting upstairs. I made sure that little cat slept with me in that bed all night. From the research I've done, I think I was almost the victim of some kind of skinwalker. It must have picked up on the sounds my dog sometimes makes late at night, knowing I'd likely come to his aid. For whatever reason, our neighbor's black cat had scared it so badly, it scrambled away. I haven't seen it since that night, maybe because the same cat still wanders around that gravel road late at night. Maybe it decided I just wasn't worth the trouble. Either way, whether I have my father to thank, or just pure luck, I leave a can of cat food out every single night for that little black cat. And the most ironic part of all, that cat's name is Halloween. I was traveling through America when this happened. I'd made it to Nevada and found myself in a bar in some small town. I ended up chatting with some random guy at the bar, telling him about where I was from and where I was headed. Told him that I'd be in town for a couple more days before moving on. As we were sitting there, sipping on our beers, a rough-looking guy entered the bar. He looked like a typical biker that I'd seen in American movies. He had this long beard, bandana, shades, leather jacket. It was so stereotypical that I gave a little laugh when I saw him. The guy I was sat with gave me a real serious look. "Hey, don't mess with the bikers, man." His tone was so serious that I stopped chuckling immediately. I didn't mean nothing by it, it's just that where I'm from, guys like that are rare beasts indeed. Well, the two of us sat there drinking for a little while longer before I said goodbye to the guy and headed back to my hotel. Anyway, next evening I went back to the same bar. Ended up talking with some other guys at the counter. They seemed friendly enough. This was 20 or so years ago, but I remember their names to this day. George and Steve, a couple of other out-of-towners. We spent a few good hours laughing and drinking together, just generally having a great time. All of a sudden, a group of 6 or 7 of those bikers walked in. They all looked just like the guy from the night before. Same biker clothes, ragged look. Hard compadres, put it that way. I remembered the old guy's advice from the night before and decided to look away. Didn't want to make eye contact with them, just in case. Don't mess with the bikers, right? Well, George and Steve didn't get the memo. They started muttering under their breaths about how ridiculous those guys looked, how they were trying too hard to look cool or tough or whatever. One of the bikers comes up to the bar, stands right next to George's stool and orders a drink. That's when George started making fun of the guy, saying how he reeked of bad body odor. Well, he said this a little too loudly, and the biker heard him. "What was that?" the biker asked George, with the gravelly voice of a guy who smokes 40 a day. George had had a few drinks by this point, so rather than apologize, he went whole hog. "I said you stink worse than a fat guy's arse crack. You hear me that time, buddy?" The biker just smirked at George, looked me and Steve over in the process. The barman handed the biker a bottle of beer. The biker took a couple of big chugs, then, without warning, smashed the bottle over George's head. That's when the other bikers moved in on us. They roughed Steve and I up pretty bad, but nowhere near as bad as George. The barman didn't even try and stop them. Either he was friends with these guys, or he was smart enough not to get in the bikers' way. They grabbed a hold of all 3 of us and took us outside. Steve and I could still walk, but they were just dragging George at this point. Alongside all of the motorbikes outside was a Jeep. They led us over to it and threw us all in the back. My head was spinning at this point, and rather than be filled with panic, I just remember thinking how weird it was that these bikers had a Jeep. Several of the bikers crammed themselves into the vehicle with us. The others rode alongside on their bikes as they drove us out to God knows where. After a long drive, the Jeep came to a sudden stop. One of the bikers next to us opened the door. I looked out. We were in the desert. They kicked Steve and I out of the Jeep, but left George inside, half conscious. All the bikers hopped back inside the vehicle. The driver rolled down his window. It was the guy George had made fun of. "You should pick friends with better manners," he told us. Then, with George still inside the vehicle, they drove off into the night, kicking up dirt as they went. Steve and I walked for a couple of hours before we stumbled upon civilization again. We were dehydrated, exhausted, and in agony, but the first thing we did was find a phone and called the authorities. We told them everything we could. Where we'd been, what had happened, and that George was still missing. Despite having so much information to give them though, the cops never contacted me to say they'd made any arrests or progress or anything. I never heard from them at all. I stayed in contact with Steve for a little while after this. He never did hear anything else about George. We figure he's out in that desert somewhere. Doubt he'll ever be found. Don't mess with the bikers, man. This is a memory from my childhood that still chills me to this day. I've pieced the whole story together from what I can remember and what my family has told me. I'll try and keep it brief. Anyway, here's the story. I was young at the time, maybe only 3 or 4 years old, and my parents had taken me out to an amusement park for the day. Spent most of our time in the kiddie section with all the really tame rides, the kiddie attractions and that sort of thing. Now, I don't remember how I became separated from my parents, but according to them, they looked away for a split second and I was just gone, vanished into thin air. As you can imagine, they became erratic, screaming my name and running all over the place looking for me. My father ran up to one of the workers and told them I had disappeared. The worker sprang into action fast. They had all been thoroughly trained for such an incident. He immediately pulled out his radio and reported a Code Adam, or something like that, a code they used to report that a kid's gone missing. All of the exits were closed immediately, and nobody was allowed to leave the park. The most senior guy there came up to my parents. My mum and dad started telling them as much information about me as they could, about my hair, my clothes, but the senior guy told them to forget all about that. "Look out for your daughter's eyes," he said, "not her clothes." It soon became obvious why he said this to them. I was found 5 minutes later in one of the park's toilets with 2 women. One of them was shaving my head, and the other was changing me into boys' clothes. They were trying to disguise me and sneak me out of the park. If successful, they had likely planned on selling me. Luckily, I was found in time, and the women were apprehended so they couldn't do this sort of thing to another child again. No doubt I looked a little weird with a half-shaved head, but my parents were extremely relieved to see me and have me back in their arms. It's disgusting, the depths some people will sink to. To think how differently things could have ended up had the staff not been so professional. This is something that happened to me a while back. I lived in Canberra at the time, and had just been out drinking with my buddies late one night at a local watering hole. The bar was close enough for me to walk home, but required me to go through a park. It was late, 1 AM to be exact, so I figured the park would be totally empty. I started walking through it. When I reached about the halfway point, I heard something coming from the woods that surrounded the park. It was something I didn't quite expect to hear. The sound of a baby crying. What the heck? Who was out in the woods with a baby at this hour? I stopped in my tracks and listened intently. The crying continued. It wouldn't let up. Didn't sound as if anyone was coming to comfort the baby at all, like it was alone out there or something. I guess I'd watched too many horror movies or listened to too many scary stories on YouTube or something, but my drunk mind went into overdrive, thinking that this was a freaky scenario. I got real paranoid and dashed through the park along the pathway, not going anywhere near the tree line. It was a shameful thing to have done, to not check if everything was okay with the crying baby, but I was young and stupid and selfish. Turns out, being young, stupid and selfish may have just saved my life. I later learned there had been a number of violent robberies and stabbings in that park. A few days after I heard the baby crying there, a man was apprehended in those woods. He'd been hiding in the trees, playing the sound of crying babies on his phone to lure people towards him. He had done it several times already. Once he had gotten them deeper into the woods, he attacked the people he tricked, stabbing them and robbing them. The guy literally had dozens of different tracks of babies crying and dogs whimpering on his phone, all for the purpose of luring people towards him. Talk about an evil trap. He was literally targeting the people with the biggest hearts. I felt ashamed at the time, but I'm damn glad I didn't investigate that crying noise. The following story was translated from the Japanese website 2chan. I live on the outskirts of Sapporo in Hokkaido, Japan. It's an extraordinarily safe place to live, albeit a little freezing cold. This story just so happened to take place during a particularly cold winter there. The whole area was covered in snow, and the sun was beginning to set. I was power walking along the Ishikari River, desperately trying to get home. Even after living here for the past 10 years, I still haven't gotten used to that damn cold. As I made my way along the riverside, I noticed a man up ahead, standing with his back to me. He had his hood up over his head, and, despite all the snow, he was barefoot. I scanned the area, and there was absolutely nobody else around. Now, as I mentioned, I lived in an extremely safe part of the world, but even still, I felt a little uneasy. there was just a weird atmosphere about the guy. The way he was standing completely still, with his back turned to me. Well, he obviously wasn't looking at the river. Was he just standing there, staring at the ground? Not to mention, I'm a 5'2" petite woman, and this guy appeared to be at least 6 foot, very tall by Japanese standards. Still, I put all those worries to the back of my mind. The man remained perfectly still as I came to pass him. I muttered a quiet, "Good evening," under my breath, in a vain attempt to ease my unease, I suppose. He didn't reply as I walked past. All I could hear were the sounds of my footsteps, rhythmic and predictable. After 10 or 15 steps, though, something interrupted the flow of their beat. I turned around and saw that the barefoot man was following behind me now. But his face, the best way I can describe it is like a mannequin, or one of those wooden figures that artists use. Don't get me wrong, his face was fleshy, but there were no features. His head was faceless, just like a Noppera-Bo from Japanese folklore. As I picked up my pace, he did as well. Now, extremely frightened, I broke out into a sprint, desperate to get away from the faceless man. Looking back over my shoulder, I could see that the man was running at full speed as well, no longer just keeping pace, but actually gaining on me. I'd never felt such fear in my life. I managed to make it to a corner with a bridge. From it, passing cars could see me. If this was the end, there'd at least be witnesses. I turned around one final time to see how close the man was to me now. But that's the thing. He was just standing there, frozen in place once again. He stood, facing me, if you want to call it that, and remained motionless as I fled into the distance. I ran all the way back to my home, unsure of what to do. Should I call the police? What should I tell them? That I saw a Noppera-Bo? As the night went on, I continued to deliberate. By midnight, I decided to sleep on it. I fell into a deep slumber, exhausted by the events of the evening. I was awoken by a series of loud, melodic notes. It was my front doorbell. I rubbed my eyes and checked the clock next to my bed. 3 a.m. What the hell? To say I was surprised would be an understatement. I have an app on my phone with a camera that's linked to my doorbell. That way, I can see who's standing at my front door without ever having to get up and check. I opened the app to see who in God's name was ringing my doorbell at 3 in the morning. The live footage from the camera popped up. Standing at my front door, with his head close up to the camera, was that same faceless figure I had seen by the river. It had somehow followed me. I dropped my phone in a state of pure shock. In a panic, I immediately ran into my bathroom and locked the door. My mind was racing, and I knew I had to call somebody for help. The police, my parents, my friends or my neighbors, I didn't care. Just anybody who could make this faceless man disappear. Stupidly, I had left my phone on my bed after I dropped it, but I was far too scared to leave the safety of my locked ensuite. After 20 minutes, I finally worked up the courage to go and get it. I lifted my device, and, with my eyes half covered by my hands, reopened the app to see if he was still standing in my doorway. The live feed popped up again. The faceless man was nowhere to be seen. I took the opportunity to call my father. I told him some strange man had stalked me to my house, that he had come for me in the night. Needless to say, he rushed over and arrived only a few moments before a police car. He had taken the liberty of calling them for me. I explained the situation to them all, told them about bumping into a faceless man by the river. I showed them my app, which confirmed my doorbell had indeed been activated at 3 in the morning. Frustratingly, The app didn't have a record function, so I had no definitive evidence to show them. "Okay," said one of the cops. "Be on the lookout for a man with no face." "Got it." I thought he was mocking me, so I insisted I was being serious. "Oh, believe me, I'm taking this seriously, ma'am," he said. "You're not the first one around here to report this guy." As of right now, nothing's come of their investigation. I don't know how many people in my town have claimed to have seen this guy, but from what the cop said, I at least know I'm not the only one. There's one final detail I have to share. When the police searched the area, they found a set of footprints in the snow, mud and grass around my house. They led from my front doorstep all the way around the perimeter of my house. Whoever had left them had stopped outside every one of my ground floor windows. The prints had obviously been made by somebody walking barefoot. No DNA could be extracted from them. I live in a remote, rural part of East Oklahoma. Nothing but farmland, wide empty fields or forests all around, depending on which direction you're looking. The nearest town is a solid 10-minute drive away from here, and before that, there's barely any signs of life at all. Oftentimes, I feel a little isolated here, especially since I live by myself. I arrived home from town one evening, just before sunset. It had been a long day at work, and to be honest, I was exhausted. I fed my little dog Curly, a Jack Russell Terrier, and then set about fixing up some dinner for myself. After that, I eased myself down into my armchair and flicked on the TV, put on some mindless show to zone out to. Just what the doctor ordered, I thought. A nice, relaxing evening. As I watched TV, my eyelids became heavier and heavier. At some point, I drifted off to sleep. I woke up in my armchair a couple of hours later to the sound of Curly barking. "Damn dog," I said, frustrated. "Oh, shut up, would you?" With that, Curly obediently fell silent. Good boy. It was pitch black outside now. The TV was the only thing lighting the room. I felt groggy and dazed, the way one does when they're suddenly woken up mid-nap. I stood up and made my way towards the kitchen to get a glass of water. I walked through to the hallway. Like I said, I was in a tired frame of mind, which is probably why it took me a moment to process that my front door was wide open. I always leave my front door locked. Living alone in the sticks can make a guy paranoid, and I never take any chances. My first thought was that some animal had wandered into my house while I slept, but that of course didn't make any sense. As far as I knew, there weren't any animals in this part of the country that could unlock a door. My thoughts went to Curly. He never usually barked for no reason. Confused, I walked back into the living room. There, hiding under the coffee table, was Curly. I'd never seen him like this before. He was looking directly into the dark dining room ahead of him, staring at something with surgical focus, absolutely transfixed. Had he not been shaking, you'd have probably thought he was a small statue. He knew something I didn't, namely, what was in the dining room. All I could see through the doorway was darkness. The sound of a commercial played in the background from my TV. I inched closer to the dining room entrance, and Curly began to squeak, as if to warn me not to go in. I must have only been about 6 or 7 steps from the doorway when I heard creaking from my dining room floorboards. My throat began to feel tight as the reality of the situation dawned on me. Then, through the blackness of the entrance, a huge, hunched-over figure stepped out towards me. It walked through into the living room and stood up in front of me. It was the tallest man I had ever seen in my life. He must have been 7 feet tall, and he looked to be well dressed. His upper body was immensely broad, but his lower body and limbs were long and stick-thin, like an emaciated skeleton. Its head, I wanted to vomit when I looked at it. It was far too small for its huge body, half the size of a normal human head. The light from my TV lit up its face. I thought I was going to pass out, but I couldn't help but stare at it. The best way I can describe it was like the face of a porcelain doll. Its skin was extremely pale and had absolutely no blemishes or markings, with a sheen like it was made of china. The shape of a human face was there, but the features were like a child's and looked as if they had been painted on. It was like a giant, living doll. The expression remained frozen on its face as it just stood there, looking down at me, 6 steps away from me. Hell, maybe only 3 steps for him. We just stood, looking at each other for what could have been 5 seconds or 5 minutes. Curly was going wild. It was surreal. That's when it let out the most disturbing, distorted wail I have ever heard. The tall man then stepped awkwardly towards me, the expression on its baby face unchanged. I ran to escape it, but it pushed past me and made for the front door. It ran out of my house, its thin legs struggling to hold up its body. I dashed upstairs to get my rifle, terrified it might return. I checked it was loaded, and then looked out my bedroom window. I watched from my window as the man-thing sprinted from my house. It leapt over the fence separating my property from the field next door and began running through the empty plains. It was a dark night, but there was just enough moonlight for me to make out one final, disturbing detail. Without stopping, it twisted its head around until it was on backwards, so those soulless, empty doll eyes could look back at me as it ran away. My stomach almost hit the floor. It kept its porcelain face turned towards me as it faded into the tree line at the end of the field. I knew I should call somebody and tell them what just happened, but who? Hello, police. A huge doll man thing just broke into my home and he took nothing. You know, what could I say? I confided in friends and family, who, guess what, told me I was going nuts. Hence why I'm sharing my story here. I wanted to get this off my chest, share it with people who might actually have something more constructive to say about my experience. People who won't just call me mad. I've done some research, and it seems like there have been some similar sightings in Hawaii. I don't think I can be alone in my experience. If anyone else knows what these things are, or has any other information to share, please, let me know. It was late one night, and I needed to take the tube, the London Underground Metro, back to my apartment. Unfortunately, I'd failed to keep an eye on the clock. I'd made it to the station, but the last train home was in just a few minutes. I rushed down the escalators, corridors and stairs to the platform, only to see the train doors close right there in front of me. It took off through the tunnel, leaving me stranded. Damn it. I didn't have a lot of cash, so paying for a taxi all the way back to my home was going to sting. I took a seat on the platform so I could rest my weary legs and think for a moment. No more than 2 minutes after the last train had left, to my surprise, I heard the sound of another train coming down the tracks. That was odd, I thought. There had been no announcements through the station speakers, and the sign that displayed all the upcoming trains was just blank. Not to mention, when I checked the timetable for the trains, the previous train was definitely the last one scheduled. I decided not to question it, and just accepted that karma had thrown me a bone. The train began to slow down, and as it did, I could see inside every passing carriage. There was nobody on the train. Each carriage was completely empty. I mean, I figured there wouldn't be many people catching the last train at this hour on a Wednesday, especially since this station was relatively quiet at the best of times, but it seemed odd that there was nobody else on board. As the train came creaking to a halt in front of me, the strangest thing happened. Unlike all the others, the carriage that stopped directly in front of me was absolutely full of people. I was a little weirded out, to be honest. Why was everybody in this part of the train and not the other parts? Only the doors for the full carriage lit up. All the others remained inactive. Guess this journey was going to be a tight squeeze. I got ready to push my way on board, and in typical British fashion, kept my eyes low and my earphones in. Don't want any of that uncomfortable social interaction now, do I? As the doors opened before me, I tried to push past the people standing directly by the door. I'm only a small person, and figured I'd find a little nook to stand in further in the carriage. As I nudged past the first few travellers though, I noticed something. Their bodies didn't react the way I expected. Their limbs felt hollow as I squeezed past. I mean, it didn't feel like I was pushing past flesh. Even the light force of my body moving past them seemed to make them come unbalanced and stumble from side to side. I took out my earphones to apologize and looked up to make eye contact. It hardly registered at first, but after a second of confusion, I was horrified to see that the man in front of me had absolutely no face. There was just a plastic-looking white space where his face should have been. He had a head, sure, but no facial features whatsoever. He looked just like a mannequin that you'd see at Forever 21 or something. Don't get me wrong, he was moving like a normal person. He just had no face. Just like the woman standing next to him, and the man next to them, and the one beside him, and the woman sat across from me, and the child that was with her. Everybody on board. They were all the exact same. Pure white, plastic-looking, faceless and hairless, dressed in clothes like normal people. Like a whole train carriage of mannequins that you'd see in a shop window. And what was worse, from the shape of their heads, I could tell they were all looking directly at me. All of them were dead silent. They literally made no sound. They shuffled and stood up and moved, but there was no talking, no rustling of material, no breathing or any natural human sounds at all. The silence was broken by the train doors. They started beeping, signaling that they were about to close. I immediately pushed back off the train and managed to get out just in time. The thought of being trapped inside with those faceless people, the thought of it even today. The faceless heads in the window continued to stare at me as the train finally pulled away from the platform. It disappeared into the tunnel. I decided paying for a taxi wouldn't be such a bad idea after all. This was easily the eeriest experience of my life, and I can't seem to make sense of it. If it was some kind of prank, it was extremely elaborate. There were too many people involved. Not to mention, they would have had to get their hands on an entire goddamn train. I've steered clear of using the tube at night ever since. When I was 20 years old, so 6 years ago, I worked as a delivery girl for a pretty popular pizzeria in my area. Initially, I worked the late morning to mid-afternoon shift, but when the guy who delivered for the night shift ended up getting fired for losing his license, I was placed on the night shift. I really didn't want that shift, because you never know if people who order late at night actually want a pizza, or if they have other intentions in mind. Unfortunately, my boss was an arsehole, and essentially told me that if I wasn't willing to take the night shift, I was fired. I wasn't exactly in a position where I could be out of work, albeit temporarily, so I reluctantly worked the shift. The first month of this shift went by without any issues. That is, until I had to deliver a pizza to a house that just barely made our delivery radius. I punched it into our GPS, and the house was located in a pretty suburban part of the city. I arrive, and it's about 11 PM. The block was extremely quiet, decently lit, and mostly littered with modern townhouses. The house I delivered to was a duplex. I ring the doorbell and wait for about 30 seconds. No answer. I ring it again and wait about another 30 seconds. Still, no answer. I'm standing there, getting pretty nervous that something's about to go down. But, thankfully, a man opens the door. He looked like he was in his late 40s. He was pretty tall, maybe a little over 6 foot, and he was very skinny. I tell him his pizza is here, and he just stands there, staring at me. I ask him if he's okay, and he responded by saying, "Yeah, I'm fine. Sorry. I got off work not too long ago, and I'm zoning out a bit." Fair enough, I suppose. He hands me the money. I hand him the pizza. And as I'm making change, he says, "You're really beautiful, you know that?" Not really thinking too much into it, I thanked him for the compliment and gave him his change. I said goodnight, and he did too. I walked back to my car and finished my deliveries for the night. A few days later, I get a delivery order to the same place. I head over there around the same time as last time, and again ring the doorbell. He answers the door very excitedly and said, "Hey, it's you again. How are you?" I told him I was tired and that I couldn't wait to go home, which he chuckled at. "I know that feeling pretty well," he said as he was pulling out his wallet. As he's counting his money, he asks what my name is. Being kinda tired at this point, and not really thinking too straight, I stupidly tell him my name. As I'm making change, he asks if he could have my number, as he'd, quote-unquote, love to hang out with someone as gorgeous as I am. Whoa, buddy, pump the brakes. I've literally only met this guy like twice to deliver a pizza. I had no idea who this guy was, and I'm positive he barely knew who I was as well. Another thing to mention is that I looked way younger than I was at the time. I was told by numerous people that I still looked about 15, and I was hoping that he thought differently, and wasn't hitting on me because he thought I was a teenager. I'm just standing there awkwardly for a few seconds, before I muster out, "Sorry, I have a boyfriend." He gets upset and says, "Oh, okay, I see." We stand there in silence before I tell him to have a good night and walk back to my car. He says nothing and still stands at the doorway, staring at me until he finally went back inside once I started my car. I got a pretty creepy vibe from this guy and even brought it up with my co-workers. They agreed it was pretty creepy. They all agreed, that is, except for my boss, who overheard everything and claimed that I was just making up stories for sympathy. Fucking arsehole. A week later, I'm working the night shift, and we get an order from that same guy again. This is when shit really hits the fan. I arrive at the house around 10:30 p.m. Keep in mind that from my perspective on the road, it didn't look like a single light in that house was on. I get out of my car and I walk up to the front door with the pizza box. As I'm approaching the door, it quickly swings open to reveal the man. Except this time, he was wearing a suit. I jumped back. He laughs and says, "Sorry if I scared you. I saw you out of the window and figured I'd just open the door now so you wouldn't have to ring the bell." I was getting scared because, as I mentioned before, there were no lights on in his house whatsoever. He was just sitting in the dark this whole time? If so, why? I nervously laugh and say it's okay. He asked me if I liked his suit, to which I said yes. He then asks me, "Would you like to go on a date with me tonight?" What the fuck? I once again tell him that I have a boyfriend, to which he chuckles, gets close to me, and says, "Honey, there's no way a girl your age is in a serious relationship. If you go on a date with me, I'll show you how a real man treats a girl." He grabs the pizza box from me and throws it to the side. He then grabs me by my arms, hard. I'm officially shitting bricks at this point, and trying not to cry from the fear that was overwhelming me. I start pleading with him. Dude, please, I just want to go home. I don't want to go on a date tonight. He just stares at me with the most sinister look I have ever seen on someone's face and says, I don't care. Get inside, now. We're gonna have a good time. He starts trying to pull me into his house, and I'm trying to resist as hard as I can. After a bit of struggling, he lets go of one of my arms and starts grabbing something out of his pocket, which I presumed was a knife. I did something that, to this day, I am thankful worked. I used my free arm to punch him as hard as I could in the stomach. This stuns him for a few seconds, and he loosens his grip on me, allowing me to break free. I quickly run to my car, and as I get in, he runs at me and starts trying to pull me out, holding the knife in the other hand. Why are you making this so fucking difficult? I grab a half-empty bottle of soda I had in the cup holder and throw it. Luckily, it hits him in the head, and he lets go. I slam the door, and then, all of a sudden, he jumps right on the hood of my car and starts scratching and banging on my windshield with the knife. I put the car in reverse and quickly back out of the spot, reversing down the road with him desperately trying to hold on. He's banging on my hood, screaming, "Stop the fucking car!" I turn onto the next road as swiftly as possible, and luckily, he falls off the hood of my car. I slam the gas as hard as I could to get as far away from that sick bastard as possible. In my panicked state, I drove a couple of blocks down the street and kept making turn after turn onto other side blocks as I feared he was following me. Eventually, I reached a red light, and I slammed on the brakes and just sat there at the intersection, frozen from what had just happened. I began crying and violently shaking as I was sitting there. It dawned on me that I had just come close to losing my life, and I couldn't help but feel that I shouldn't have been alive. Once the light turned green, I pulled over to the side and just sat there, crying. Eventually, I get the energy to drive back to the pizzeria, and almost immediately after I walk in, my coworker knew that something was wrong with me. I practically broke down in front of him, and everyone else came to the front, wondering what was going on. I fought my tears and explained everything that had just happened. My coworker comforted me, and my boss surprised me and began apologizing profusely for what had just happened and for putting me on the night shift. He takes me into the office and handed me the phone to call the cops. They arrive at the store, and I give them my statement, as well as taking pictures of any marks on myself and any scratches on my car. My coworker followed me as I drove home, and I collapsed on my bed. Strangely enough, I managed to fall asleep. I quit my job the next day, and luckily, a friend of mine managed to hook me up with a new job at her clothing store. As far as the psycho goes, 2 days later, I received an update from the police. The entire duplex was owned by the guy's brother, who lived on the right side with his wife. The psycho lived on the left side of the duplex. I learned that he had been in and out of jail constantly, at first for robberies and assaults, but later on, it was for sex crimes. He had been released from jail for about 5 months before this encounter. When the cops arrived at the house, he was long gone, and his family had no idea where he had run off to. The police insisted that they would find him. Indeed, they did. Only not alive. Apparently, the guy had fled to a nearby city and attempted to kidnap a teenager walking alone late at night on the street. Luckily, somebody happened to be looking out their window at the right time. They called the cops, and the police caught him trying to force her into his car. He manages to flee, and the police chase after him. He blew a red light near a busy boulevard, and a van slammed right into the driver's side of the car. By some sort of miracle, the driver of the van only sustained minor injuries. The psycho, on the other hand, succumbed to his wounds long before the ambulance even arrived. I thanked the officers for everything they had done and for informing me, and I walked out of the station. I walked down the street and light up a cigarette, taking in everything I had just been told. I don't wish death on people, but after hearing about his death, I felt relieved. I felt relieved that he couldn't hurt anyone anymore. I was relieved that I would never have to encounter him again, and that I wouldn't have to go through with charging him and reliving what had happened that night. My last experience 2 years before this was scary, but I think this one takes the cake as being the scariest, as I was alone and face to face with a psycho. Who knows where I'd be if he managed to pull me inside that house. My friends and I grew up in Oz, in a pretty run-of-the-mill suburban area. Our circle of friends was large back in the day, but the 4 core members of our little unit were myself and my 3 best friends, Johnny, Kev, and Seth. We were 16 years old at the time, and having a movie night at Seth's house. His parents had gone off to Perth for the weekend, and we had the whole place to ourselves. Well, not just us. Seth was looking after his German Shepherd, a big old doggo called Bonzo. When we had all arrived, our first move was obvious. Help ourselves to Seth's dad's stock of booze. We spent the next few hours playing video games, roasting each other, and fawning over Margot Robbie in The Wolf of Wall Street. We got about halfway through the movie when there was an unexpected knock on the door. Seth looked confused. He wasn't expecting any more visitors. At his request, I get up and go to the door with him. Maybe we'd been making too much noise and his neighbors were coming over to complain. No. Standing there on the porch was a Domino's pizza delivery man. He's holding a large pizza box in his hands. Hey, large pepperoni, paid for online? What the hell? We hadn't even thought about ordering a pie. Well, as we all know, 16-year-olds and pizzas are natural allies, so we happily take it off his hands. I mean, prepaid. It was like a gift from the gods themselves. Who were we to say no? Yeah man, that's ours, Seth says. He gives him a couple of bucks for his troubles. You boys have a good night, the guy says, and he heads back to his vehicle. We bring the pizza into the living room and tell the other 2 how we'd just lucked out. A massive pizza for just the cost of a tip. Damn, I couldn't even remember the last time I had one of those bad boys. Well, Kev, Mr. Goody Two-Shoes as always, says that we shouldn't just eat somebody else's food. We were moral men after all. He says that the delivery driver couldn't have gotten far, and that there was still time to get him to come back. It was the right thing to do. Plus, if the store realized we'd stolen one of their pizzas, they might not deliver to Seth's house anymore. In the end, Kev managed to convince us. I guess we weren't arseholes after all. The 4 of us left the pizza on the coffee table and went into the kitchen to call up the pizzeria. We get through to them and tell them that somebody else's pizza had been dropped off at our place, that the guy should come back and get it, and take it to whichever hungry customer ordered it. They ask for our address, and Seth tells them. Are you sure it's a Domino's pizza? Yeah, mate. It's got your logo on the box. We haven't had any orders from that part of town all day. None of our drivers have been around there. Are you sure it's not a Pizza Hut box or something? Dude, I know what your pizzas look like. The delivery guy had your uniform on and everything. Well, maybe it's from one of our other stores. We'll ask around and get back to you. We were all a little perplexed, mainly because we knew that no other Domino's stores delivered to our area. Figuring this was all just some dumb mix-up, we decided to give them 10 minutes to call us back. If they didn't, well, we'd just dig in. In the meantime, we fixed ourselves some snacks for the rest of the movie. we head back into the living room, and are shocked by what we find. Bonzo the dog had stuffed his face into the box and eaten half of the bloody pizza. Some poor guy had just paid for Seth's dog to eat a sultan's feast. As funny as it all seemed, we were slightly annoyed that our good deed had gone unrewarded. I mean, if someone in the house was going to eat that pizza, we'd have rather it been us. The store never bothered to call us back, so we forgot about the whole thing and just got back to watching the movie. It's not long afterwards that the dog started to become noticeably distressed. He starts whimpering and whining and clambers off to the kitchen. Must be the pizza, we thought. Well, he could wait. It was his own fault after all. And that juicy scene was coming up in the movie. You know which one I mean. In hindsight, we shouldn't have waited. 10 minutes later, we realized that Bonzo was really ill. Thinking he must have gorged himself to the point of near death, we googled for an emergency vet in the area. We found one, and the 4 of us rushed him there as quickly as we could. Bonzo really was near the point of death when we brought him in, but it wasn't for the reason we expected. The vet said that he was displaying unusual symptoms, convulsing and the like, so we ran a few more tests. What he found churned our stomachs. Traces of strychnine were found in Bonzo's system. It's a seriously dangerous poison used for killing birds and rodents. When ingested by humans, it causes your body to spasm, your eyes to protrude from your skull, and your brain and other organs to shut down. It only takes about 30 minutes to kill you. We later found out that the cheese on the pizza had been laced with it. Seth's parents came home as soon as they found out, and we told the police everything we could remember about the guy who gave the pizza to us. Sadly, nothing ever came of it in the end. There were no other reports of anyone receiving a poisoned pizza, and it seems like the guy never tried to pull this trick again. This was just a one-off attack of opportunity. It makes me wonder, did the guy specifically target us, thinking that some dumb kids would just selfishly eat a pizza someone else ordered? If so, does that mean he'd been watching us? How else would he have known that Seth's parents weren't in? Could he have been someone they knew? The mind boggles. I'm happy to report that Bonzo did indeed survive the ordeal, if only just. Had we arrived at the vet's 5 minutes later, it's unlikely he would have pulled through. The thought that somebody might target others for no apparent reason terrifies me. If anybody brings food to your door that you didn't order, do the right thing and check with the company it's from. It just might save your life. I delivered pizzas between the ages of 19 and 23 in a crappy part of my town. One night near close, we got a shady sounding order to a fake address, and they changed it to another when we wouldn't deliver. We had a sneaking suspicion something was up, so I brought the cook with me, and we both brought large metal pipes with us. He just stood next to my car while I went to the door. When I knocked, the porch light flicked on and off a few times. I knocked again, and the porch lights flickered. It happens a few more times, until some grouchy, middle-aged man opens the door. Think Carl from Aquatine Hunger Force. Bluntly, he tells me he didn't order a pizza, and shuts the door in my face. When we left, we noticed a bunch of hooded guys in the bushes across the street. Later that night, a rival pizza chain driver was robbed on that street. This is honestly a little freaky, and makes me a bit terrified whenever I think about it, to be honest. Still, I'm willing to share. I live in England, in an old, beautiful cottage that's been in my family since my great-grandfather bought it all those years ago. Prior to him, my ancestors had all been very poor, and could scarcely afford to put a roof over their heads. The story goes that when my great-grandfather was a young man, he set off by himself up to Scotland. Several years later, he he returned a rich man and was able to buy the family cottage. He never spoke about how he made his fortune. Well, he did, but not definitively. The story always changed. One day, he might tell you it was from a business venture. Then another day, he might tell you he got lucky gambling or made a pact with a gypsy. There were so many different answers that he gave that eventually people just stopped asking altogether. Perhaps he'd come into the money illegally, they thought. That's why he always avoided answering the question. My family at the time couldn't have cared less if that was the case, to be honest. They could finally eat, drink, and buy whatever they wanted, and didn't have to scrounge to make ends meet. Anyway, over the generations, the money that my great-grandfather accumulated was added to, and to this day, we remain quite well off. The problem is, money wasn't all that my ambitious relative brought back with him from north of the border. You see, not long after buying the cottage, and still young, at the age of 29, he suddenly lost his sanity. That is to say, that overnight, he went completely mad. He started complaining about a thin, red man that kept following him. We know this from the journals that my great-grandfather kept. According to him, the thing, for lack of a better word, was a bony, emaciated humanoid with sunken eye sockets and paper-thin lips that didn't fully cover its teeth. It didn't wear any clothes. It was just completely red, like it was constantly bleeding all over, like a human man if all of the skin had been stripped from him. He said he could see it watching him wherever he went, climbing on walls and ceilings. The last entry talks about how the thing kept whispering to him as he slept, that it kept him up all night, every night, and how he couldn't take it anymore. The next day, he took his hunting shotgun and shot himself in the head, leaving his wife and his young son, my grandfather, alone. Time goes by, and my grandfather, Winston, grows up to be a successful businessman himself. Just like his father before him, he found a wife and had some children of his own at a young age. The oldest of these children was a son, my father. Unfortunately, just like his father again, my grandfather also lost his mind exactly 10 years later in life than his father. At the age of 39, he started screaming about being followed by a red figure. He said that the thing creature stalked him and would appear out of the blue when he least expected it. He handled these hallucinations better than my great-grandfather had been able to. For all intents and purposes, life went on for him. But sadly, the hallucinations persisted and got worse over time. According to my grandmother, he used to say that the thin red man wouldn't leave him alone anymore. Finally, 10 long months after becoming mentally ill, he was found dead in the pond of the family estate. According to the coroner's report, my grandfather had been sleepwalking and somehow managed to unconsciously make his way to the pond outside. For whatever reason, he didn't wake up and drowned in the water. I never met either of those men. They both died before I was born, obviously. I've only ever read my great-grandfather's journal and listened to stories about my grandfather. My own father, however, I of course knew very well, and his story is what haunts me the most. Like his father and his father before him, he met a girl and had a family at a young age. I was the eldest of his children. I'm grateful that I got to know my father growing up. He was a kind man, funny too, and very smart. He always took care of my mother, myself, and my siblings. Our youths were amazing. When my father turned 49, I noticed that something wasn't right at home. He and my mother kept his mental condition a secret from us youngsters, but eventually the truth slipped out. While home alone with my dad, he broke out into sweats and started telling me that he was seeing the thin red man. This was the first time I'd ever heard someone telling me about seeing the creature firsthand. He said it was just like it had been described in the journal, the stuff of nightmares. Thin, tall and bony. He often saw it late at night while in bed, crawling across the ceiling of the bedroom, twisting its head backwards to stare down at him. My father held out for a little over a year, suffering from constant night terrors, which over time became day and night terrors. Things seemed to get worse and worse, and no amount of medical assistance seemed to do a thing. Eventually, he took his own life. I don't want to go into details about that, but it was definitely deliberate. I miss him greatly. We all do. As it stands, I'm 26 years old. I too met a girl whilst I was away at university, and the two of us are currently planning our wedding. She wants to start a family, and to be honest, so do I. I'm inclined to believe that all of these deaths in my family have been the result of a genetical mental illness, one which I hope I won't develop. I'll definitely be keeping an eye on it, I can tell you that much. I like to think that the only reason my father and grandfather saw the same red figure was because they had both heard about it from my grandfather's journal. They had read the story so many times that it had just slipped into their subconscious. So, when they started to lose grip of reality, their hallucinations manifested into this red man. Still, I'd be lying if I said that the thought that this could be a family curse didn't affect me, seeing as I'm my family's firstborn son. For whatever reason, it seems to only affect the men in our family. I just hope that I never meet this thin red man face to face. And, for the sake of our first future baby, I really hope it's a girl. This isn't a personal family curse story, obviously, but one that I find particularly interesting is what you might call the curse of the dragon. I'm sure you all know who Bruce Lee is. Before him, his father was also somewhat famous back in Hong Kong. He was an operatic actor called Li Hui Chuen. The story goes that Hui Chuen once angered a group of Chinese merchants, did the dirty on them, so to speak. Whether this was a deal gone wrong or a double crossing, I couldn't tell you. Regardless, he got on their bad side, and as a result, they put a curse on him and his bloodline, saying that all of the males in his family would die young. Fast forward a number of years, and Hui Chuen didn't live a particularly long life, dying less than a week after the birth of his grandson, Brandon. We'll get to him in a moment. Hui Chuen's son, the legendary actor Bruce Lee, died even younger than his father at the age of 32. It's believed that he suffered an allergic reaction to a painkiller, which caused his brain to swell up inside his skull. The exact cause of death is still shrouded in uncertainty, and there are a number of conspiracy theories surrounding the last moments of his life. Even more conspicuous, however, was the death of Bruce's own son, the actor Brandon Lee. He's best known for starring in the action film The Crow. It was thought that he would go on to have a successful acting career just like his father, but sadly, he never got the chance. The curse of the dragon struck once again on the set of The Crow. During one of the movie's sequences, Brandon's character was meant to be shot by a thug. The gun which was being used as a prop, a .44 Magnum, was loaded with blanks to make the scene more realistic. However, at some point prior to shooting, one of the prop crew accidentally left a live round in the chamber. The actor with the weapon had no idea about this, and when it came time to film the scene, he pulled the trigger and ended up shooting Brandon in the chest from a distance of 12 feet. He was immediately rushed to hospital. After 6 hours of surgery, however, Brandon succumbed to his injuries and died on the operating table. The remaining scenes were filmed using body doubles and special effects, and the movie went on to gain a cult following. Brandon himself was buried next to his father in Lakeview Cemetery, Seattle. He was only 28 years old. Having had no sons of his own, it seems like the curse of the dragon has finally been lifted. Whether you believe the deaths were the result of a family curse, or just a simple set of tragic coincidences, the world lost a lot of talent when Bruce and Brandon died. May the Lees rest in peace. This isn't a family curse that affects my family, but rather my friends. Every year, on May 25th, all of his family gather together at one of their homes and spend the next 24 hours in the same room together. Nobody leaves until midnight, and nobody ever leaves the eyeshot of another family member. They don't sleep. They just spend the time eating and talking, waiting the day out. If one of them needs to go to the bathroom, they'll go in groups and keep each other in their sights. When my friend and his siblings were kids, they thought this was just some family tradition that every family in America took part in. As they got older, their mother let them know that there was a much more serious reason they did this. For as long as the family on their mother's side could remember, every year, on the 25th of May, one of their relatives would go missing. In the past, this seemed to happen without fail. Some would eventually turn up dead, but for the most part, they just disappeared, never to be seen or heard from again. It could be any one of their blood relatives that happened to go missing on the day. A cousin, an uncle, an aunt. As long as they shared blood with that side of the family, they were at risk of vanishing, at risk of falling victim to the family curse. Sort of like a deadly version of roulette, if you will. Generations ago, when their family started to notice a pattern emerging, the various related households created the tradition of coming together on the same day every year. By keeping an eye on each other, nobody was ever going to vanish into thin air. In the years when everyone in the family stuck to the plan, it worked, and nobody would go missing. This had apparently been going on in their family for centuries, before any living family member could remember at least. Everyone would just come together, stick together, and wait the day out. Occasionally, a cousin or someone might decide that the whole May Day family curse was hogwash, and go off to do something else by themselves. If they spent any of May 25th alone, even just like driving somewhere or going to the bathroom by themselves, then it was going to be their year to take the bullet. One year, my friend's second cousin, Tony, ignored the family ritual and went off to see a concert with some friends instead. 3 weeks later, they found his body off the side of the motorway. He had lost control of his car and crashed into a tree. Took people ages to find him for some reason. According to my friend, 2 other family members had gone missing in his lifetime alone. He has no idea what happened to them. Nobody in the family does. Whatever you make of this story, I think it's pretty interesting, and I know for a fact that my friend and his family still have these gatherings every year. They don't spend 1 minute of that particular day out of eyeshot, and if the story's true, I can't say I blame them. Everyone who returned to see the house my grandmother grew up in died of violent death within months. No one has gone back to her country in a long time, but the few relatives who went back to the town after all of these deaths stayed far away from the house. One died in a fire, one fell down the stairs, one was electrocuted in a freak accident, one was found at the bottom of a ladder. My family comes from Haiti, voodoo country. One night, when I was very young, my baby sister fell sick with a dangerously high fever. Nothing my parents did made her any better, and the doctors were stumped. I was with my parents at the time, and I recall how at one point during the evening, a strange old man entered the room. He said that a curse had been placed upon the child, possibly by some sort of jealous witch who always wanted a daughter or something. "I can save her," he said, "but the curse will pass on to another person. Do you accept my offer?" Not really understanding what he meant, and desperate to try anything to bring down their daughter's fever, my parents agreed. The mysterious man knelt over my sister and said a prayer, then placed his hand upon her forehead and whispered something under his breath, whilst in some sort of trance-like state. "It is done," I remember him saying. Was it done though? I mean, nothing had seemed to change. My baby sister still had a fever. Assuming he was just some crazy guy, my parents pretended to be grateful and sent him on his way. Before he left, however, he said something that chilled me, even as a child. "Now somebody else in your family is dead." That made us all uncomfortable. Still, he left without causing any more trouble. Through the night, my little sister cried, but amazingly, she did seem to be getting better. By morning, she was right as rain. It was a miraculous recovery, and one that perplexed the local doctors. Nobody could seem to explain it. Elated, my mother paid a visit to all the members of the family to tell them the good news. She got to the doorstep of her sister, who we'll call T. When the door was answered, she was met with her sister's crying husband. "I was about to call you," he said. During the night, T had a heart attack. She didn't make it. My heart sinks whenever I think about that old man who came to visit. I'm grateful he saved my sister's life, but the whole incident scares the life out of me. My story's a bit odd. The males on my father's side of the family always die in October. My grandfather, his 3 brothers, their 4 sons, and my great-grandfather. The last thing my grandpa ever said to us as we were leaving his house on summer visit was, "Well, if I make it through October, I'll see you all at Christmas." He died October 3rd of a heart attack. The plus side to this is I'm effectively immortal 11 months of the year. So, there's that. I was having a drunken heart-to-heart with my dad the other night, and we were sharing some stories from the past. He told me an experience he had back in the late 1980s, which he described as the luckiest escape of his life. After hearing the story, I'm inclined to agree. He was about 25 years old, and going through a rough patch in his life. Him and my future mum had just broken up. They would later get back together, but that's a different story. Anyway, he needed to get away for a while. As such, he decided to rent out a cabin for the weekend. Just him, the birdsong, and a few beers. He booked one in this really remote, wooded area. He goes and collects the keys from the cabin's owner, a really nice guy in his 30s. Friendly, helpful, no trouble whatsoever. He gives him a quick tour of all the rooms, asks if there's anything more he can do, and then leaves my dad to it. My dad spends his first day there relaxing and recharging, enjoying the beautiful scenery and trying to take his mind off his crummy situation. On that first evening there, he heads out on a long walk through the nearby woods. He wants to clear his head outside before the sun sets. He gets a little bit lost, however. By the time he gets back to the cabin, it's already dark. He enters the cabin, and immediately, something strikes him as weird. The curtains at the back of the cabin were drawn closed. Strange, he didn't remember closing them before he went out on the walk. Then again, his head was all over the place that weekend. "Hello?" he calls out. No response. Shaking it off as a mistaken memory, he walks into the bedroom to go to sleep. Again, something seems off inside. It wasn't the curtains again. There weren't any windows in the bedroom area. He says there was just a strange atmosphere in the room. He felt tense and ill at ease. Something in the back of his mind, in his subconscious, told him that there was a threat nearby. He grabbed his car keys and jacket, walked out the front door, got into his car, and drove to a hotel. For whatever reason, he refused to stay in that cabin. At the end of the weekend, he returns to the cabin at around 4 p.m. to drop the keys back to the owner. To his surprise, the owner's already there, along with several police officers. They're all astonished to see my dad. You see, the cabin's owner had come by a little earlier than he and my dad had agreed to collect the keys. Obviously, my dad wasn't there, so the owner had a look around the cabin to check that everything was alright. On the couch in the living room, there was a large, muddy shovel. That was a little weird, he thought. Then he entered the bedroom. Inside, he found several Polaroid pictures laid out neatly on the bed. They were of my dad, taken at various points throughout the day. One of him drinking a beer outside, one of him looking out the window. One was even of the cabin owner handing him the keys. They had all been taken from within the tree line. On the back of the last picture, someone had left a handwritten message. So close. Realizing that someone had been stalking my dad from the very beginning of his trip, and that my dad was now missing, the owner immediately called the police. When they arrived, they scoured the woods in search of my dad. Not too deep in, they found a freshly dug hole, 4 foot deep, 7 foot in length. My dad arrived an hour later. The brain's a funny thing. Sometimes the subconscious takes in information that we aren't fully aware of. Perhaps something else was slightly out of place in the bedroom, or just different to how we left it. Whatever the case, the warning signals went off, and he listened. If this story has taught me anything, it's to always listen to my gut. Instinct probably saved my dad's life that night. This didn't just happen to me, but my friends, Macy, Eric, and Dorian too, while we were all out on a trip in northwest Montana. Macy's parents had a cottage out by Flathead Lake. One weekend, we all decided to head over there and do a spot of fishing. In this digital age, it's very easy to lose touch with nature. Personally, I was starting to feel like a caged animal that summer, trapped indoors with no reason to go outside. Well, no reason other than my crappy part-time job. I guess we all just wanted to reconnect with the great outdoors. They say that when you're around old friends, you act the same age that you were when you met them. That was definitely true for us. We were a bunch of 19-year-olds, goofing around like we'd just hit puberty. Some things never change. We get to the cabin, and it's absolutely beautiful. A serene little log cabin, far out in the middle of nowhere. It was nice to get away from the bustle of our town. I mean, the cabin still had internet and everything, so it's not like we were totally living off the grid. But for us, this was going to be a taste of what it felt like to be a real outdoorsman. We all unpack and get to fishing as planned. Not many bites that day, sadly. Dorian wandered off by himself, looking for a better fishing spot. When he finally came back a while later, he seemed a little agitated. He told us that while out fishing a ways away, he heard what he thought was rustling in the tree line to his right. A little concerned about what it might be, he kept an eye on the area. Most of his attention was still focused on his rod in the water when he heard what he thought was a bell ringing from the same spot in the trees. He swore that he saw a figure watching him from the bushes. Not that he could make out many features. He was still a fair distance away, but it looked like he was wearing a hoodie and crouching. That's when he grabbed his gear and hightailed it back to us. This put us all on edge. The closest cabin to ours was far, far away. We weren't expecting to see another soul this whole weekend. Still, it was probably nothing. We called it a day and headed back to the cabin early. We ate dinner and joked around until sunset, though we all kept occasionally glancing out the window. None of us said what we were looking for, but it was obvious that Dorian's story had made us all a little paranoid. Being the dumb kids we were at heart though, we decided to stick around for the night. When you're deep in nature, the nights are particularly dark. No light pollution. Looking out the window was like looking into the abyss unless you pressed your face right up to the glass. Then you could just about make out the outlines of the trees that surrounded us. To us, the slight fear we were all feeling was kind of fun. You know when you're with your buddies and you get spooked by something, but for whatever reason, you all kind of stick around and try to spook each other as well? Well, it was kind of like that. If any of us were by ourselves, we'd have been freaking out, but since we were all together, it was a sort of mini rush. Eventually, it starts getting late and we hit the hay. We're all sleeping in separate areas of the cabin. I'm in the living space on the couch. I'm exhausted from the long day, and the sound of the wind outside is sending me off to sleep. I'm almost out cold when I hear the distinct sound of a bell ringing. It was coming from just outside the front of the cabin. It sounds off once, and then again, and again, sometimes quick and loud, sometimes slow and faint. I'm sitting upright in a heartbeat, and I don't have to call for my friends. They're all congregating in the living space now, keeping their voices low. "It's the guy from the bushes," Dorian whispered to us all. "He's outside the cabin." Pressing my eyes close to the window, I could see that he wasn't wrong. Out in front of the cabin, facing us, was a figure in a goddamn rocking chair. He was sitting stiff, rocking back and forth in the breeze. We have no idea how to react. After a while of watching in fear, Macy, the bravest of the group, opens up the window and shouts to the guy to go away, that his prank wasn't funny. The guy in the chair doesn't react, just sits there, rocking gently, the sound of the bell ringing out. We grab a few knives and cautiously walk out the front door of the cabin, staying in a tight group. I was just following Macy at this point, to be honest, hoping that he knew what he was doing. "Get out of here," Macy shouts as we slowly get closer to the guy. Again, he doesn't react, and for good reason. The guy in the chair isn't alive. It's an old, dead man. We panic. Eric made a break for the tree line before coming to his senses and running back to the cabin with the rest of us. We locked the door and made sure all of the windows were sealed tight. Then we called the authorities. It took what felt like a lifetime for them to finally find us. They were just as weirded out by the dead old man as we were. Examining him in greater detail, they said that whoever he was, he'd been dead for a long time. They could tell from the decomposition. He was most likely disinterred from his grave. Namely, some sicko had dug this poor guy up and put him in that damn rocking chair. Whoever had done this had also tied a small bell around the man's neck, which rang out as the chair rocked back and forth. A very light set of footprints could be made out in the dirt, leading up to the chair from the tree line. The authorities couldn't find a set leading back though, so God knows what direction the perpetrator walked off in. To our knowledge, the investigation never came to anything. Whoever was watching Dorian from the woods that day remains at large. Why they dug up the old man and used him to terrorize us, I have no idea. While I was growing up, my family would visit the same lake every year for a week every summer. We'd stay in the same cabin every time. As we got older, we would visit a large rock we called the Cliffs and jump off it. The rock was only 15 feet tall at its highest point, but the water was really, really deep. When we got older, we'd jump in and try to touch the bottom, but we never could. When my brother and I were in our teens, we took kayaks out to the cliffs to jump off on our own. We jumped off several times, and when we got too cold, we'd take a break on the top of the cliffs to warm up in the sun. As we were sitting there, we noticed a white shape in the water, floating towards the surface. It was a letter. H. Eventually, it sank back down into the water, and we lost sight of it. Before we could look away or say anything, another shape was floating upwards. It was the letter E. Eventually, it too sank below, but it was soon followed by two more letters, L and P. We didn't jump in after that. We stood up and left without saying a word. We never mentioned it to anyone, and I forgot it even happened after a while. Several years ago, I was working as a camp counselor, and I told this as a ghost story. I'd forgotten about it, and I texted my brother to see if I hadn't just made it up completely. I asked him if he remembered the time we went to the jumping cliffs alone and saw something in the water. He replied yes, that he did remember. I asked him what it was, and his reply was, letters. They spelled help. I was spending a long weekend with my family in this log cabin. Nobody else around for miles. It was late afternoon, and I decided to go for a walk by myself through the woods. About 10 minutes in, something starts to feel a little off. I realize that it's because of the sound, or more specifically, the lack of it. The woods had become dead silent. No bird chirps, rustlings, or general nature noises at all. Just pure, unnatural silence. Anyone who spends a lot of time outdoors will tell you that a quiet forest is a dangerous forest. I hear someone approaching from in front of me. When he comes into view, I see that it's a lone man in his 50s. As we come to pass each other, I get a close look at him. He's got thinning, grey hair, deep wrinkles across his forehead, piercing grey eyes, sickly, patchy skin. The reason I'm mentioning the details of his face is to highlight that this wasn't a mask. He's got this big smile plastered on his face, and his eyes are so wide they look like they're bulging out of his skull. This expression is frozen on his face. As we get closer to one another, his head turns so that he can keep his unblinking eyes fixed on me. A little creeped out, I give him a polite nod. He gives me nothing in return, just that wide-eyed, toothy smile. As we finally cross by each other, his head is turned to the side, his vision still fixed on me. I continue past him, but I'm on guard for obvious reasons. What the hell was this guy doing out in these woods, so far from civilization? There wasn't a house besides our cabin for miles. I glance over my shoulder to check that he's not following me. The blood drains from my face when I see him. He's still walking away from me, but his head is facing me, like it's on backwards, an impossible angle, that messed up expression still on his face. I'm overcome by this sinking feeling, and I sprint off deeper into the woods. I want to put as much distance between me and him as possible. When I feel safe enough, I slow down and slap myself back into reality. The birds are chirping like normal again. Whoever that man was, he was walking in the direction of our cabin, but none of my family members caught sight of him. If this was some sort of prank, then I have no idea how he managed to get that effect. It was too real. Nor can I think why he'd be out in those woods, all by himself, where he'd most likely encounter no one. I still get nervous when I pass by strangers in the woods, and I always turn to check that they're not keeping an eye on me after I've passed them. My Uncle Carlos is a private investigator in Mexico, in a sort of middle-class area. Not exactly paradise by American standards, but far from the cartel nightmare that the country is sometimes painted as being. Don't get me wrong, it's like that in some spots for sure, but not here. Uncle Carlos used to be a cop, but a serious injury meant that he could no longer perform his duties. Not knowing what else to do, he started up his own investigation firm, figuring he possessed the necessary skills to do the job well. He imagined it would be a sort of lethal weapon lifestyle. When I was growing up, that's exactly how he described it. He'd tell me all these crazy stories about the cases he was working. They always involved covert missions, catching the bad guys, the occasional gunfight. They were all massively embellished, obviously, if not downright fantasies altogether. You see, the sad thing about PI work is that in reality, it's rather dull. Lots of mundane cases, mostly marital affairs. Hours of mind-numbing surveillance. Not really the buddy cop movie life that my uncle made it out to be when I was a kid. As I got older, he stopped making up these fantastic tales to keep me entertained, and started telling me about the reality of the job. Since his stories had made me want to follow in his footsteps, this was a major disappointment. One night, when I was even older, I was having a drink with my dad and Uncle Carlos. The topic of work came up, and I reminded my uncle about all of the stories he used to tell me as a kid. "It's a good thing the job isn't really like that," I said. "You wouldn't have survived your first day, Uncle." Yeah, he said. "Though I gotta tell you, kiddo, there was a reason I stopped making PI work sound so appealing." "What do you mean?" I asked. My uncle goes uncharacteristically quiet. Then my dad turns to him, and with a smirk on his face, says, "Hey Carlos, just tell him about the Solano case." "The Solano case?" My uncle gave my father that look. That one that means, "Yeah, I have your blessing to spill the beans?" "What the heck," my dad says. He's a big boy now. Turns out, my family had intentionally kept this story from me when I was a kid. They didn't want to frighten me. My parents had also asked my uncle to stop glamorizing his job, not wanting me to have ambitions of becoming a PI in the future. Anyway, here's the story my uncle told me. The Solano case happened all the way back in 2006. Uncle Carlos had been working as a freelance investigator for a good long while by that point, and had built up a reputation for himself. Word of mouth led a new client to his office, a woman called Maria Solano. Expecting this to be another cheating husband type gig, my uncle sat her down and asked her to tell him the nature of the case. What she said couldn't have been further from what he expected. Mrs. Solano's son had gotten involved with a gang of thugs in the area. It worried her and her husband, because their son wasn't anything like these guys. He was a smart kid, did well at school, and was hoping to go to university. They were far from a bad family. For whatever reason, he had started going to the gang's clubhouse every night. Soon, that became every day and night. It got to the point where the Solanos hadn't seen their son for 3 days straight. Fearing for their son's safety, Mrs. Solano's husband went to confront the gang on their own turf. Mrs. Solano sat for hours at home, waiting for her husband to return. He never did. The police did little to help her. They seemed unwilling to do much at all. Every time they made a half-assed effort to find the woman's husband and son, they'd come up with nothing. This confused and infuriated her. It was obvious who was behind both of their disappearances, the gang of thugs. Were the police unable to do their job, or just unwilling? She continued to hound the cops, demanding that they investigate. Some time passed, and Mrs. Solano received a phone call. It wasn't from the cops, though. On the other end of the line, a deep male voice told her to stay out of the gang's business, to stop searching for her missing family members. Said that if she valued her life, she'd cut her losses and move on. According to Mrs. Solano, the voice sounded a strange mixture of threatening and concerned. It also sounded vaguely familiar to her. She couldn't quite place who it was exactly, but she felt as if it was someone she had talked to before. Someone who worked in a local store, perhaps. She decided not to heed the caller's advice. Since the police refused to be of help, she started doing her own detective work. She went sniffing around the gang's headquarters. Unfortunately for her, this didn't go unnoticed. That very same afternoon, she received a letter while she was home alone. Inside it was a severed human ear. A note attached read, "We told you to stay away." Out of desperation, Mrs. Solano came to my uncle for help. The only things she could give him to help were pictures of her missing loved ones and directions to the gang's hideout. My uncle took the job. The first thing he did was call up some of his old buddies in the force and ask them what they had found out. The cops gave him nothing and warned him to drop the case for his own sake. Jesus, what the hell was going on? Not having anything else to go on, Uncle Carlos decided to drive to the gang's hideout at night and do some sleuthing of his own. He followed Solano's directions. Turns out, this place was remote. Real remote. A medium-sized shack out in the middle of nowhere, completely secluded. Getting close to it wouldn't be an option. It'd be too obvious. Instead, he parked up on a vantage point overlooking the shack and used a pair of binoculars to keep an eye on things. It was a particularly dark night, so as long as he kept his lights off, he was effectively invisible. Now usually, surveillance work is long and boring, but knowing what was at stake with this case, my uncle was fully engaged and focused. Over the course of several hours, he saw numerous gang members entering the shack. In spite of that, there was no sign of Mr. Solano or the son. As the night went on, things became extremely disturbing. In the early AM, about 15 or so gang members exited the shack, all of them naked and covered in white paint. They had built a large fire outside, which they were now circling. Then they stood there, contorting their body into strange, unnatural shapes. One of them led a dog out to the fire from the shack and proceeded to slit the poor creature's throat. As it died, they were all screaming, chanting, making inhuman sounds. All of this was so loud that my uncle could hear them clearly from his vantage point. This wasn't a gang. It was a cult. This was some fucking weird sacrifice. These guys were nut jobs, a bunch of fanatical freaks living out in the sticks, most likely off their heads on drugs. Why on earth were the cops ignoring these guys? Fearing his cover might get blown, and honestly really freaked out by what he had just witnessed, my uncle made a quick getaway. The more he looked into the group, the more he realized their cultish tendencies. It became obvious to my uncle that the police were either terrified of these guys, or were in their pockets. Potentially, a few of them could have even been members. He doesn't know. The reason he doesn't know is because he was forced to drop the case. You see, Mrs. Solano went missing. Just like before, the police did little to look for her. To this day, nobody has found a body or anything. No information about her or her family's disappearance exists online. Nothing. It's like they never existed. For whatever reason, the Solanos became ghosts. After the woman's sudden disappearance, Uncle Carlos himself started receiving threatening calls, telling him to stay out of the group's business. His cover had somehow been blown. They said that if he continued his investigation, then he'd end up like the others, and his wife and daughters would be sold into sex slavery. Since my uncle had nothing left to gain and everything to lose, he did what they wanted and dropped the case. They had already proven themselves to be people of their words after all. It's bothered him ever since, but there really wasn't much else he could do. His clients were most likely dead. The cops were either bribed, scared, or in on the whole thing. It was all totally messed up. As for the family's son, well, either he's dead too, or was brainwashed by the group and is still a member. Whatever the case, there was nothing Uncle Carlos could do about it. The risk of trying to expose the group was just too high. In the end, real life isn't like those detective shows and movies. The bad guys don't always get caught, and life just goes on. Makes me wonder how many other disappearances those bastards have been responsible for over the years. I don't know if you've heard of Missing 411. It's a series of books about people who have disappeared in the wilds of North America. Not typical missing person cases, though. Obviously, people go missing for all sorts of reasons. They get lost, maybe even attacked by an animal. Heck, a lot of the time, they want to go missing. No, these books deal with the unusual cases, the ones that nobody can seem to explain. The only reason I bring them up is because I'm a private investigator. I found out about these books after working on one particularly strange case, and now I'm certain that something strange is going on, and that people are trying to cover it up. I had been hired by a family to look into the disappearance of their son, a young man we'll call Chad for the sake of anonymity. Chad had gone missing in Yosemite National Park a year prior. The police got nowhere with the case, and the park rangers were being decidedly uncooperative. I'd worked on missing person cases before, and was confident that I could at minimum find some leads. We agreed on a price, and they told me everything they could about the moments leading up to their son's disappearance. On the day in question, Chad had gone out hiking with his friend. Now, these boys were outdoorsmen, went camping all the time, hiked all over America, were used to spending time in the great outdoors. What I'm trying to get at here is that these guys knew what they were doing. When the boys didn't come home that day, a search team was sent out to look for them. All that was found of them were their boots. 2 pairs of empty boots, standing ominously in a clearing, their owners nowhere to be found. No bodies, no blood, no footprints. Police dogs couldn't pick up any scent. Apparently, the animals got confused and started walking in circles. Now, these types of cases are usually pretty cut and dry. Most likely, they would have succumbed to some sort of injury, accidentally fell from a great height or something. But the whole area had been searched thoroughly. There was no trace of them. Bear excrement in the area had been collected and analysed. Nothing. Like Chad's parents had warned me, the park rangers were of little to no help at all when I tried to talk to them. They were evasive, hostile even. That was odd. I'd dealt with the Yosemite Rangers before, and they'd always been happy to assist me. There was a strange lack of evidence for a case that had been open for so long. It honestly left me stumped and unsure of how to approach things. That's when I came across the Missing 411 books. The author of these books has researched over 2,000 missing person cases that all share similar, mysterious characteristics. They all seem to happen in clusters around national parks. The few who are found alive tend to have memory loss, and those whose bodies are found died in indeterminable ways. The majority remain missing. When they are found, however, it tends to be in places that are seemingly impossible to get to by foot, or in places that had previously been explored thoroughly. In one such case, the body of a young boy was found laying perfectly out on a tree stump, many days after he had first disappeared, in an area which had been searched many, many times. Many of these people vanish in the presence of family and friends. One moment, they're right there. The next, they're gone. Much like with Chad and his friend, the police dogs in these cases never seem to be able to track a scent, and their handlers note how weird the creatures start acting. Experienced outdoors people vanishing off the face of the earth. Experienced hunters whose guns are found next to all their equipment. The weapons are never fired. The majority of them are similar age to the missing boys. Nobody knows exactly how many have vanished, but it's what's quickly becoming known as the nation's silent mass disaster. In the end, I couldn't give Chad's parents any answers. This was an impossible nut to crack. No matter how you look at it, things don't seem to stack up. Then, When you hear about all of the other similar cases in Missing 411, things start to make even less sense. All around this great country of ours, someone, or something, is taking our people. Some weird shit is going on in the woods, man, and I don't know how to explain it. I generally try to keep my cases private, but I'm willing to share just this one because it's so noteworthy. I was working a case for this woman a few years back. She was an absolutely gorgeous lady. Youthful, slender, dark eyes and hair. A real catch. Yet despite all of that, she thought that her husband was cheating on her behind her back. I asked her what aroused her suspicions. Had she found lipstick on one of his shirt collars? The smell of another woman's fragrance on his clothes? She said that she had no physical evidence. She just said that her husband had started acting a little off, coming home an hour or two later than usual, seeming a little colder and more distant. She figured he had taken a lover. Well, the wife had plans to stay at her parents' place that weekend, so what we decided to do was lay a trap to find out for sure. When her husband was at work, she let me into their house to place a few nanny cams and audio collecting devices around the joint. In my country, that's all above board and legal. Makes the job a lot easier than in some other places. Now let me tell you, their house was an absolute palace, and it turns out that the rich one in the relationship was her. Gorgeous and rich. I remember thinking that her husband must be an absolute moron if he was cheating on a broad like this. All the cameras were in place, and the woman leaves for her parents' place while I monitor the footage from my van outside. A couple of hours pass, and sure enough, in walks the woman's husband. This unremarkable sales type. A real suit. If a guy like this was cheating on a girl like that, he must be a real idiot. Another hour or two go by as I just watch this guy lazing around the house. Surveillance can be the worst. Sure enough though, someone eventually comes to the door. Busted, I think to myself. But it's not a woman. It's another man. Okay, now things were starting to make sense. But it's not what you think. This wasn't a lover's rendezvous. This was a business transaction. As I listen in to the conversation, it starts to become apparent what's going on. The guy at the door was a hitman. The suit wanted his wife dead, presumably so he could inherit her huge fortune. While his wife was away, this bozo was showing the would-be killer the layout of the house to make his job easier. That was their plan, to make it look like a home invasion gone wrong. The husband was going to conveniently be away from home on the night it happened. Had this woman not come to me when she did, she'd have had days, literally days left to live. Needless to say, I contacted the police immediately. Of course, the two of them denied everything, but I had all the evidence needed to ensure they'd go down for conspiracy to commit murder. That's 2 life sentences right there, and 1 life saved. So there you have it. Those 2 arseholes are rotting in a cell somewhere. The woman got more for her money than she could have ever imagined, and when people ask what the most interesting case I ever worked was, I get to tell this story and feel like a bit of a hero. All in a day's work as a PI. Well, nah, not really. It's mostly just sitting around and eating biscuits. But still, this was a career highlight. Hopefully that woman chooses more wisely in the future when it comes to her romantic endeavours. If she's listening to this, I'm still available. A buddy of mine clued me into this sub a while back, knowing that I'm a total sucker for creepy stories. Reading the posts that search and rescue guy made a while back, I felt compelled to share a few experiences of my own, mostly because his stories struck a chord with me as being similar, at least in tone, to a few of mine. even though his are definitely a tad weirder. I never got around to it, but I have a little free time at the moment, so why not? Thought I'd share, cause I feel you guys will appreciate these stories, and because I'd like to get them off my chest. Talking about the bizarre to others always tends to remove a bit of the gnawing feeling that surrounds it, even if the respite that results is brief. I've worked as a private investigator for around 5 or 6 years now, running my own business. It's usually a pretty bad idea to just up and start an independent PI company as your gateway to the job. In fact, it's pretty darn stupid. But I live in a town that's small enough that I was able to make it work. My first year or so was pretty rocky as I tried to adjust to the job, but having a couple of friends in the field to give me pointers here and there definitely helped. I eventually began to hit my stride, and as my reputation increased, so too did my client base. I won't be specific about where I live, nor will I use any real names. As a PI, people come to me with some pretty personal shit, and it's universally taboo to just go sharing the specifics with the world. The extent I'll admit is that I'm in Canada, and that I'm in a small, semi-remote town surrounded by vast, boreal forest. Not the kind you'd go exploring or hiking through with friends, but the kind that you would stay away from, because, much like the stereotype, there are bears and caribou all over the shop. Trust me, caribou will fuck your day up seriously bad. So, with that little bit of preamble out of the way, I suppose I'll start. I tend to get a lot of cases from paranoid spouses, and most I'll take, however absurd. I'm in no position to turn down a paying customer, and when they turn out to be correct, it always feels good to help them out an unfaithful partner. This case, despite having a reasonably explainable conclusion, was creepy enough to have definitely caused me to think a little more about what to accept and what to decline. Roughly 2 years ago, I get a cold call from what sounds like an older man. He asks to make sure he's called the right place, and when I tell him he has, he immediately launches into a particularly long-winded rant about how his wife is plotting against him, and how she's planning to take him out. I try to get him to calm down, and ask when he'd be able to come over to the office, so we could discuss things over a coffee, what he should bring, hash out whether or not this was a legitimate case, and if so, negotiate a fee. He's adamant that he needs to see me as soon as possible, so he comes in a couple of hours later. I don't have any cases at the time, so I'm all for it. He's an older gentleman, in around his late 50s, early 60s probably, and is visibly shaken when he shows up. We talk for a little while, and he's definitely calmed down by this point, but he's still obviously frightened. He tells me that his wife has been going out to meet with other elderly women for a sort of book club type deal, and that he's sure that they're all out for his blood. Things get really interesting when he reveals that every morning, around 4 AM, he's woken up by an abnormally loud sound, like dogs barking and growling frantically. He tells me that he always wakes up to see his wife standing in the bedroom doorway, and that 2 other elderly women resembling a few of her friends are always standing motionless behind her, making no movements, just staring. The creepy part is that his wife is still in bed with him, sleeping. They don't move as long as he doesn't, but he tells me that as soon as he performs anything noticeable, they stumble off before he has a chance to put his glasses on to get a better look. The few times that he had gone to check, he found his back door opened, but never anything else out of place. I'm a little weirded out, and at first think it must be sleep paralysis, but the fact that a previously closed door is open, and the fact that he's able to effortlessly move around rules that out. I ask if he has a carbon monoxide detector in his room. He tells me he does, and that it hasn't ever gone off. I ask about things like his address, when his wife usually leaves, when he usually leaves, the location of her book club, pictures of his wife, her friends, things like that. We come to an agreement. I take the case, and he goes off on his way. I head off to his place that night, and park my car on his street, in a location in which I can see his front door and the gate leading into his backyard. I set up my camera and turn on a podcast, since I have to be there before he goes to sleep to ensure I don't miss it, since it's possible that they could arrive before 4 AM. I'm out there for around 6 hours with no signs of any activity. The roads are dark, save for dim country streetlights, and more or less barren. There's this almost piercing feeling of silence and isolation, not unlike the town had suddenly become entirely deserted, like I'm the only living thing outside on that night. My podcast had long ended, and a permeating essence of dread enticed me to turn the music that had replaced it off, for fear of unspeakable whispers worming their way into the silence between guitar strums. 3:30 AM sharp, and almost as if on cue, the sound of a dog barking nearly gives me a heart attack. What's worse is how incredibly loud and oddly distorted it is. That is, it's odd until I realize that it's multiple dogs, as if every dog on the block started barking in eerie unison. This is when I catch a glimpse of them in my rearview mirror. 2 small, shriveled figures, and one taller, more lithe one, all slowly stumbling across the sidewalk, all clad in white dresses, appearing so suddenly, it's like NPCs have just entered my draw distance. The tint on my windows ensures they don't see me as they pass by, but I'm nonetheless silent as a mouse, deathly afraid that one might peer over into my window as they pass. Their footsteps echo as they pass my car, and as they do, my blood runs cold. It is not, in fact, 3 old ladies. It's 2 old ladies, dragging along one lifeless, stark white mannequin, rigid like a corpse, fresh from the grave, and dressed as the old man's wife. I try to shake myself out of my daze, and begin to take a few pictures with one cam, video them with the other. Sure enough, they turn right down his driveway, their mannequin in tow, and one of them unlocks the back gate, vanishing from view. I check the footage and pictures to make sure they're clear. Trying to get over the horrid bizarreness of the whole situation, I try to think of something, since it's obviously not a good idea to just leave the old couple there, with a pair of creepy old ladies who are probably suffering from dementia or something. Since it appears they're usually watching him for half an hour or so, I assume they've probably no intent to harm him, but one can never be sure. I pull out my cell and call up his phone, hoping to try and drive them out. A few minutes later, they're shambling away down the street, mannequin grinding against the pavement. I wait until they're out of view before letting out a breath of relief. The guy doesn't initially believe me when I tell him what happened, but I show him the pictures and the video, and he goes pale. Despite the definite creep factor involved, he reacts instead by letting out the deepest sigh of relief I think I've ever heard. He mumbles something, and I can see tears starting to run down his cheeks. He smiles a little melancholically and thanks me, saying that he has to apologize to his wife for not trusting her and not talking to her about it first. I'm not entirely sure what happened after, but I assume he took the photos to someone, as the visits stopped happening after that. I'm not sure of the details, but apparently the women had pretty much gone off their rockers due to old age. His wife had given one of them the keys, in case they ever wanted to come over. I honestly don't understand the logic behind this one, other than she's old, I guess. Either way, I believe the two of them are in a home of some kind now, and the husband made up with his wife pretty easily. I have plenty more where that came from, and from here on out, it only gets weirder. I'll try get right into it. I don't believe in the occult. I don't believe in the paranormal or anything of that sort. The case I'm about to describe did not change this. You really have to put a lot of trust in your senses, and bogging those very senses down with deductions, spotlighting supernatural interventions, is a pretty piss-poor decision if you want to get anywhere. I do, however, have my weird personal superstitions and idiosyncrasies. Wouldn't really be human if I didn't. I try and keep them separate from my job, but sometimes they pop up in the back of my mind regardless, picking and drilling at the grey matter in my skull in a desperate attempt to burrow their way back inside. For example, I sometimes feel that reality stops functioning correctly in complete isolation. That when things are left unobserved for a long amount of time, the unknown, unseen spaces cease to exist. Stuff that shouldn't be able to physically happen is suddenly no more than child's play, and unwelcome things that have no right existing play their fickle little games with us. I don't try to think about it too much, and I most certainly don't try to give the stupid little thought any power. Nonetheless, there's always the occasional case in which the idea is particularly tempting to indulge. It's the middle of summer, and the cicadas are chirping in their monotonous choir, like a million audio tapes, put on never-ending, ear-ending repeat. The summers are fairly cold up here, but at least there's no snow. I'm sitting in my office, finishing up one of my previous cases. Just general reports left, lots of paperwork. Boring stuff that seems to cause the world to drown in a cacophony of summer insects. The tedium is broken when my phone begins to ring. I pick it up, only to hear the voice of one of my closer PI friends on the other end. We chat casually for a few minutes, mostly just me trying to get my mind off of the writing pains in my wrist, but it's obvious that he's called for a reason. He explains that he's been on a missing person case, a small boy around the age of 4. His mother and father had divorced a few years ago, and his mother is currently holed up here in my area. The boy has apparently been missing for quite a while now. The police had been contacted first, but they turned up nothing. After a week passes with no sign of a missing person, you kind of have to start assuming the worst. Nevertheless, we're usually the last resort for these cases. So, my buddy goes asking around, and apparently he manages to dig up a couple of accounts saying that the kid was seen boarding an olive green SUV with a woman looking to be in her early 30s just hours before his disappearance was reported. Nobody thought to note the license plate. His dad, my friend tells me, had left his son home for half an hour to run out for groceries. Why he didn't take his son along with him, I don't know. At first, I thought it might be deliberate, like he had for some reason done it on purpose. Of course, the human brain works weird sometimes, and dumb little human errors are always possibilities. I can only imagine the grief that must be felt after realizing one of those tiny bursts of idiocy may have caused something so heart-wrenching. Long story short, he matches the description of the woman. Mid-30s, long brown hair, overall rather average looking, to a fair amount of other women. One sticks out though, the boy's mother. The child's father had been granted sole custody of the kid. Apparently, the kid's mum had a little cabin out here, which she would regularly visit, and spend days worth of time in without alerting her husband, and whenever she was back home, she'd either be asleep or out somewhere. So my buddy says he wants to team up for this one, split the pay. He's in a slightly larger town, and the closest one to mine, but that's still a good 5-hour drive. since he still has a few leads over on his end. He wants me to check out the mother, see if anything comes of that. It appears to me at this point that the case is pretty much cut and dry, so I accept. He emails me the address and a picture of the kid and his mother, and I finish up my paperwork before setting off. I drive around, semi-lost for a few minutes before I finally catch sight of the gravel road that breaks through the wall of bark created by the forest's border. I glance down at my phone and sigh, placing it into my pocket. Guess it was stupid to expect this to be on Google Maps. Now, I always despise having to go into the forest. As I begin to slowly pull down the path, towering green giants blotting out the sun overhead, I'm starting to regret taking this case. The gravel slowly turns to dirt, and the small break in the tree line slowly begins to disappear at my back. It's dim in here, dense pines doing a damn good job at casting an impenetrable veil of shade over the woods. Now, don't get me wrong, the Canadian boreal forests, and this one is no exception, are absolutely stunningly beautiful. Birds chirp their cheerful tunes, small rock faces jut out of the land like Mother Nature's own sculptures, and streams of sparkling clear water babble across the rocks into the cute little waterfalls, and occasionally picturesque lakes and rivers. But that's exactly why I hate these forests more than any other. More than anything, it always, without fail, seems like some horrible, sprightly facade. Like the entire forest is attempting to scrape this movie set together in order to offset the constant gnawing that I feel at the back of my neck and in the very core of my stomach whenever I come in here. The silhouette of a small building finally begins to come into view off on the horizon. So, with a small sigh, I park my car and get out. As much as I'd love to stay cooped up in that metal haven of protection, I'm here on a private investigation job. I do have to remain relatively covert. That's not happening if a car just suddenly pulls onto the front lawn of your isolated cabin. As I get a little closer, I begin to notice that something is off about the trees. I can't place exactly what it is. They just seem strange somehow. The path eventually opens up into a small clearing, a makeshift wooden gate sitting at the end of the path. It's not stopping anybody, as there's no walls on either side of it. Its only purpose seems to be presenting a tattered "No Trespassing" sign. Past the gate is the cabin. It looks to be in surprisingly good shape, and from the outside appears rather modern. In front of it is a small patch of grass, which acts as a parking space, and a few areas in which it's been worn down by tyres. Slowly but surely, my eyes drift up from the patch of grass to the car that's parked on it. My heart suddenly begins to dance around in a mixture of joy and dread. Not surprisingly, it's an olive green SUV. I pull my camera up to my face and peer through the viewfinder. The SUV, the license plate, I snap a picture of each. The frame drifts over to the cabin. I snap a picture, and it's at this exact moment I realise the front door has been wide open this entire time. I go quiet on instinct, the surrounding area suddenly feeling like it's been hit with a blast of cold air. Then I hear it. A faint humming coming from inside. Soft, like a woman's voice. Once I hear it, I suddenly become unable to stop hearing it. It's a haunting, drifting tune, equal parts melodic and eerie. Every once in a while, it stops or skips a little bit, as if its source is running out of breath or having voice cracks. Before I really even know it, I'm taking a step forward. I know it's a stupid idea, but my legs are moving faster than my mind. Just a peek, I tell myself. Just one peek to satiate my curiosity, and that's it. The cabin looms over me as I get closer. The grass crunches under my feet until, finally, just barely, the inside of the building begins to come into view. I stop dead in my tracks. Branches. It takes a moment to register, but there are tree branches covering the floor. When I say covering, I mean covering. These aren't sticks. They're long, spindly, thin tree branches, deliberately cut off of their trunks. Like a natural line, my gaze follows them to the single piece of furniture in the room. A small, white coffee table, and a CD player perched on top of it, and I realize why the humming sounded like it was skipping. The trees around me suddenly feel like they're closing in on every side, like the earth below my feet is trying to swallow me whole. I don't take another moment to sit and deliberate on it. I just book it out of there as fast as I can goddamn will myself. I launch towards my car, slam the door shut, put it into reverse, and punch it out of there. That place simply felt wrong. The first thing I did was contact the police. I sure as hell wasn't going back there, but there was no way I was simply going to let it sit there like that. They investigated, and were just as weirded out as I was, but ultimately didn't turn up anything of use. The house was deserted, save for the sea of branches, the white coffee table, and the lone CD player. The SUV, too, was near pristine, not unlike a new car. The investigations continued for a while, but it was more or less a dead end. Nobody ever returned to the cabin. My buddy's leads never panned out either, and the child's mother suddenly went missing as well. We never found either of them. In the end, things unfortunately had to be called off. I most definitely have a few theories and ideas about what went down in that godforsaken place. If I'm to try to inject some semblance of sense into this, I'd say that the mum most likely did kidnap the kid. We ran the plate on the SUV, and it was registered to her. The police searched everywhere too. They turned over the branches, looked in the car, the works. Nothing. No fingerprints, residue of any kind. Nothing. The best I can assume is that the woman took the kid up here. Probably gathered up anything important. Food, water, precious jewels, etc. And set up this whole scene just to confuse anybody who tried to find her, to throw us off her trail. She then took her kid and either managed to somehow sneak a ride out of town, or just straight up went into the woods. If it's the latter, they're both probably dead. There's still a whole bunch in there that's assumed, and has no supporting evidence, but it's the most logical thing I can think of. I've still got more stories to tell. They only get more strange, so hopefully you'll stick around. I'm very close to my younger cousin. We've been more like brothers than cousins our whole lives. Anyways, when I was around 9 and my cousin was 7, my cousin and his family moved to Waterbury, Connecticut. This was farther from us than they had been living before, but still relatively close, about 45 minutes or so. I used to spend every other weekend at his house, and he'd spend the other weekends at mine. During the summer, we'd spend half of it at his house and half at mine. I'm sure our parents always hated having an extra kid, but whatever. My cousin had made a friend with a boy, Todd, who lived just 2 houses down from him. He was a nice kid, friendly and funny. He was about 4 years older than me, and 6 years older than my cousin. Initially, he was a little off. but nothing that seemed like a warning sign to my 9-year-old brain. It was a little strange, to me, that he wanted to hang out with kids so much younger than him. My aunt talked with his parents and the neighbours though, and they assured her that he meant no harm. He was just never one to make many friends, and didn't know anyone else in the neighbourhood. Now, when I say Todd was a little strange, what I mean is, he had a thing for wild animals. He said he liked to nurse them back to health. He always had some injured animal that he was taking care of. We often wondered if he was hurting the animals and then nursing them back, but nothing really suggested that he was. It was just kind of weird that he always found so many wounded animals. As the years went by, Todd got stranger and stranger. At one point, he gave my cousin a squirrel he'd captured as a pet. The next day, the squirrel was gone, only to turn up at Todd's house with half its tail missing. Todd was upset with my cousin for letting this happen, but all my cousin did was leave him in the cage that Todd had given him. A week later, Todd came to my cousin's house, carrying a dead squirrel, screaming at us for killing it. We never touched it. As I said, I was a few years older than my cousin, and was already going through puberty, which meant I'd already discovered the great thing that you can do when you're alone. My cousin had not, so I assumed. Anyway, Todd had given my cousin some hand soap, and a handwritten instruction on how to get yourself off. He said that he would come over and show my cousin how to do it, but that it had to be when no one else was home. Thankfully, my cousin told me his plans, and I stopped him. That's just effed up. I eventually talked my cousin into telling his mother, my aunt. My aunt, obviously, was furious, and went over and screamed at Todd and Todd's parents. Shortly after that incident, my aunt and cousins moved in with my grandparents. They lived in Waterbury for a little over 2 years, and moved out in 1994. About 3 years later, Todd Rizzo was arrested for murdering a 13-year-old boy, and is currently on death row here in Connecticut. He wanted to know how it felt to kill someone. For those with a sense of morbid curiosity, the user has posted a link to Google Street View. The yellow house is the one that his cousin lived in. If you turn the camera around, there are a couple of duplexes on the other side of the street. If the user's memory serves, Todd lived in the peach one, that is right and diagonal from his cousin's house. He has also included a link to Google Street View to show you the general area of where the little boy's body was found. When I was 14, my dad and I lived in a small studio apartment on Hollywood Beach in Florida. We didn't have much money, but we treated ourselves to a takeout every other Thursday night from the same Chinese place a few blocks away. They were family run, so the same guy delivered the food every time. We found out later he was the adult son of the woman who owned the restaurant. It was my job every Thursday to answer the door and pay for the food, while my dad found something on the TV for us to watch while we ate. And never once did this unassuming Asian guy give me a reason to feel uncomfortable. He was short and tan, with grey hair and glasses. I was friendly, but not talkative. At 14, I was still in that shy stage. We never had a conversation, other than the typical hello and have a nice day. During that time, I was left home alone a lot. Both my dad and I felt that 14 was old enough to spend a few hours home alone in the afternoons after school. I was also very close with the woman who lived next door and her goddaughter, so I would spend a lot of time over there when my dad wasn't home. I walked home from school as well, and it was one school day afternoon, an hour or so after I had gotten home, that the phone rang. This was about 2004, so having a house phone was still pretty common. Ours was set up on the side table in the main room of the studio apartment. I answered it, and for a second, I thought there was going to be no one on the other end, because there was a long pause. Then there was a sort of stammering that I couldn't understand. Then the person said, "This is Alan," which was barely understandable because of the heavy Asian accent. I say Asian because I'm not sure if it's okay to assume they were Chinese just because they ran a Chinese restaurant. By now, you obviously know that Alan is the Chinese delivery guy. But at this point, at 14 years old, I was confused. Who the hell was Alan? I say something along the lines of, what? And he clarifies, "Your delivery guy. Chinese delivery." Now I'm even more confused. What does Alan, the delivery guy, want? He goes on, did you, order food? No, we did not, and I tell him so. He's quiet for another second or so, and then he says, Are you home alone? My heart dropped into my stomach. Now I'm pretty sure I know what Alan, the delivery guy, wants. And yes, I was home alone. But I wasn't about to let him know that. My first instinct was to tell him that my dad was home. But his work van wasn't outside, and I realised that Alan had been to our house enough over the last few years to know my dad's van, and if he drove by, he would know that he wasn't home. "My uncle is here," I said, but I immediately knew that it was a horrible attempt at a lie, and that Alan is going to know that. So I challenge him. Why? He's quiet again for a moment. Then a statement, not a question. "You are home alone." I'm stunned, and have no idea what to say now. As I'm trying to think of something, he says, "Never mind," and hangs up. I'm so weirded out and scared at this point, that even though part of me thinks I actually scared him out of whatever he had planned, another part of me says to go and lock all the doors. So I do, front and back. By the time I get back to the front room from locking the back door, I look out the front window and see a car parked in the driveway. It's Alan, just sitting in his car. The windows are rolled up and lightly tinted, but I can see him behind the steering wheel, just staring at my front door. 30 seconds later, the house phone starts ringing again. I don't answer it. Alan stays parked in the driveway for about 5 more minutes. I stand looking out the window the whole time, thinking to myself that the second he got out of the car, I was going to grab a knife from the kitchen. The house phone starts to ring one last time. I don't answer it. As soon as it stops ringing, I pick it up and dial 911. I was terrified, but not because of Alan. I was afraid my dad was going to be angry at me for calling the police. It's a completely different story, but he and the law have not always been on the same side, and I was raised with a sort of subliminal aversion to the police, and the idea that anything I couldn't handle myself, my dad could handle for me. Alan drove away while I was on the phone to the 911 operator. I was in the middle of telling her that he was calling the house and parked in the driveway, when he just put the car in reverse and sped down the street. The police took a statement from me when they got to my house, and then sent me next door to hang out with my neighbour and her goddaughter. We sat on the front porch and I told her the whole story of what happened, while the officers went down to the restaurant to talk to Alan and contact my dad. In the end, Alan was able to get off with a warning, by telling the officers that there was a confusion, and he thought that we had ordered food, which his mother confirmed. When asked why he wanted to know why I was home alone, he said he was trying to get an adult on the phone. The police told them that they would have to get someone else to make deliveries to customers in my area from now on, and to make sure that Alan keeps his distance. In all honesty, I think it was my dad's phone call to the restaurant later that really made Alan realise how much he had fucked up, and not the warning from the cops. He was fuming when I told him the story, as I imagine most fathers would be. He called the restaurant and spoke to the woman who owned the place, and then somehow convinced her to put Alan on the phone. What followed was one of the greatest conversations I have ever heard, even if it was only my dad's side that I was hearing. Nothing makes you feel more loved than your dad in macho protection mode. My dad was throwing insults I'd never even heard before, and I was in middle school, a kingdom of insult connoisseurs. I knew it was a very serious situation, and I knew that my dad was really angry, but I was in the background, stifling my laughter into a pillow. At one point, my dad asked Alan what the fuck he was thinking driving over here, to which Alan responded something about being lonely, and my dad said, "If I ever catch you on this street again, Alan, if I ever hear that you are near this street, I will make sure that you are lonely for the rest of your life by ripping your fucking dick off and choking you with it." We stopped eating Chinese food after that. I have always had an innate fear of the night. As a child, my imagination was overcome with stories of creatures that come alive at night, and the safety offered by a house and light. I never had anything to base this fear on, until a night when I decided to go out with a buddy of mine to a baseball game, and got stuck at a light at 2 AM after dropping him off at home. Of course, that night, the game went into extra innings, and so I didn't get a chance to drop my friend off back home until well after 1 AM. Everything was fine on the way home, until I hit a light right before the street that led to my house. It was a T-junction, and I was turning left. The light itself is one of those that you think is broken, until it finally turns green right before you finally decide to just run it. Of course, I turned up just as the light was turning red. I would have just run the light, seeing as no one was there, and it was closing in on 2 AM on a school night. But earlier that week, I had heard the phrase, "Character is what you do when no one is looking," and for whatever reason, that was the night I decided to prove to myself that I was a man of character. Big mistake. I pulled to a stop at the light, feeling good about myself, bordering on self-righteous, when I happened to look out my window to my left, and noticed a lady sitting all alone on a bus bench. We made brief eye contact, and I quickly looked away. It was too late. I could see movement out of my peripheral vision, and I knew that she was coming my way. I looked out the window and noticed she was carrying a bag. I quickly checked that my doors were locked and all my windows were up. I then moved my right foot above the accelerator just in case, and braced myself for what was about to come. I was hoping it was just going to be an awkward exchange, and was praying for a quick light change before she reached me, so I could just get the hell out of there. I knew there was a slim chance of that. She walked right up to my window, put down her bag, and began to tap on my window. I nervously looked up at her, and she motioned for me to wind down my window. I had automatic windows, so I just imagined pushing the button too hard, and the window just coming all the way down, so I took a deep breath and lightly flicked it with my finger. The window moved microscopically down, but she didn't seem to notice or care. She then leaned in and began to talk. She said, "My boyfriend beat me up. I have a friend who lives down the street. Can you give me a ride?" I should stop and give a brief physical description of the bag lady. She was small and skinny and of indeterminate age. She was either in her mid-20s and had lived a hard 20+ years on the street, or she was a 60-something-year-old who had been living a moderately hard life on the street. All that to say, just by looking at her, there was no way to verify her story. She looked beat up by life, and not just by her boyfriend. But there was something very strange about her delivery of this sentence. It was robotic and seemed practiced, and like she was disconnected from the moment. That made my skin crawl, and after a brief debate in my head on whether I should do it, I told her that I had to get home and I could not give her a ride. After my first refusal, she leaned in even closer and said the same thing again. My boyfriend beat me up. I have a friend who lives down the street. Can you give me a ride? This time, I felt more confident when I declined to give her a ride, and told her that I had a curfew and I had to get home. She leaned in a third time, and began her statement again. My boyfriend beat me up. At this point, the light changed. I slowly lifted my foot off the brake, and started slowly rolling forward, and began muttering an apology. She didn't move. She just looked at the light, then looked down at me, leaned in closer, and said 5 words that have haunted me ever since. You made the right decision. Then she picked up her bag and walked back towards the bench. I peeled out of the intersection and cried and screamed all the way home. I have no idea what she was planning on doing, or if there were people waiting to jump me in my car from the bushes had I moved to let her in. But that encounter has haunted me ever since, and has confirmed in my mind that nothing good happens after dark. My mum, brother, and I had finally arrived at my grandmother's house after a very boring 7-hour drive. It was a trip we made every year, but not usually around this time. We'd always usually visit around Christmas, but this time it was October, the 18th to be exact. What seemed like 50 or more pumpkins with carved faces adorned my grandma's porch. Halloween has always been my favourite holiday, so I was excited to see that my grandma had made such an effort to celebrate the occasion. We unloaded the car and made our way up the creaking stairs into the near 50-year-old house that my grandparents had built. We were met immediately with the smell of freshly baked apple pie and my grandmother giving us all hugs. She told us not to get too comfortable because we would be taking a small walk down the street. I thought it was rather strange that she wanted to go on a walk, seeing as it was already getting dark around this time. But I didn't want to appear rude, so I just nodded my head and replied, "Okay, sounds good." She led us down the gravel driveway, and we began walking down the street. The neighbourhood itself was in disrepair, and there were a number of vacant and decaying houses. We had ventured a couple of blocks when she stopped in front of a 2-storey, obviously abandoned house with a green roof. The place looked like it should almost be considered condemned, as it didn't look safe to even go in. It was a white house, but it had dirt and mud seemingly caked all over the outside, and the wooden porch looked ready to collapse at any time. I could see a few other people arriving to the property on foot, when my grandmother announced to us that it was actually a haunted house that had been set up by a man living in the neighbourhood for Halloween. She said it was the first night that the house would be open to the public, and that it should be opening any moment, as it was now completely dark outside. A huge grin spread across my face. I loved haunted houses, even the ones that are just for entertainment purposes and are not actually haunted. Almost immediately after she'd finished talking, a tall, grungy-looking man exited the house and asked everyone to gather at the front porch. He then proceeded to inform us that he would be leading us into the house and to follow him. We all complied, and began walking up the dilapidated steps into the home. We were met by an extremely nauseating stench. I don't really know how to describe it, other than it was the most god-awful, overpowering, eye-watering inducing smell I had ever encountered. We continued following the man. He appeared to be leading us downstairs and into the basement. I remember thinking that was strange, as this was supposed to be a haunted house, not a haunted basement. He threw open the door to the basement, and the smell that I had previously thought was the worst smell my nose had ever had the misfortune to breathe in now seemed like nothing more than child's play. There were a couple of people who even began to gag at the smell. We couldn't see much of anything inside, at least not yet. The man flipped a switch that dimly lit the room. This basement seemed larger than any basement I had ever seen. We made our way all the way down the stairs, and just stopped in the middle of the room. The man then put his arm out, and sort of pointed towards the wall, and began to turn in a circle, as if to profoundly display what he was hanging on the walls. There were fake dead bodies hung on crucifixes all over the walls. My mum moved closer to inspect, and I moved with her. She got very close to one of the bodies, and moved her hand to touch the corpse's hand. I remember the look on her face after touching it. She seemed terrified. She grabbed me by the collar of my shirt and ran towards the door, shoving the rest of my family in front of her and pushing us up the stairs and out of the door. I could hear, as we were running to the front door, the rest of the people that entered with us now also quickly exiting the room. Once outside, my mum whipped out her phone and dialed 911, as did seemingly all the other people in the group, as they also pulled out their cell phones. The police seemed to arrive almost instantaneously. They must have had a car nearby or something. They entered the house and walked out with the man in handcuffs. Other police cars had arrived by this point, enough so that they lined the entire block. They ended up taking the man away in a car, and a few officers stayed behind to take written statements from the people who had entered the house. I later found out that the man's name was Donald Van. He was a serial killer who they had been searching for almost 10 years, and the bodies in the house were very much real. I sometimes wonder if we were meant to be his next victims, or if he was just proudly showing off his work to us. One thing I do know though, is that I'll never forget that smell. It's almost like it's burned into my nose. Links to articles about this event can be found in the description below. This is actually a story about my stepmom and her best friend. I have my own, but I'm so hesitant to drag some of them up. I'm hoping telling someone else's story will open me up a little bit more. My stepmom didn't like us much, but she told my sister and I this experience growing up to scare us out of being stupid. It was my family's stranger danger story. My stepmom, we're going to call her Macy, grew up as a kind of privileged teen in the 70s, and her mum had moved their family over here, the States, from England when she was about 9. She went to a pretty nice high school in a really nice town. There, she made friends with a girl, Lily, who didn't exactly run with Macy's type of crowd, popular, stereotypical, etc. But they really hit it off, and Lily would take Macy out to do her type of stuff, which was hiking, fishing, sailing. There's even a hilarious set of pictures of them camping. My stepmom has raccoon eyes and looks like she hates everything. Anyway, because of Lily's influence, the two of them would do stuff like that a good amount. One Sunday, they decided to go on a hike in some hills about an hour away. Macy put on what I'm sure were her extremely expensive hiking shoes, and the two of them drove off to the hiking trails. Lily parked in this big clearing with makeshift parking spots. You know, like a piece of wood making the head of a space. But there were no other cars there. This was only important in hindsight. They started hiking up the hill, off the path because Lily fancied herself as something of a badass. The hike was nothing extraordinary. If you asked my stepmom, she would probably just lament for 15 minutes about how sticky and buggy it was. Anyway, they reached the top of the hill and my stepmom was done. The polished, pampered side of her was coming out, and she groaned until Lily, begrudgingly, said okay. They would rest and then walk down again, slower. They'd been heading down the hill for maybe 10 minutes, when Macy started bitching again. Lily conceded to walking down the side of the road instead of the rough hiking trail. So, there they are, probably looking like a couple of tools geared up for hiking and walking down a crappy road. And after not even 5 minutes, a truck pulled up next to them. It was red and rusty, and just generally looked like a clunker. The guy driving rolled down the window, and the girls looked in through the passenger's side window. He had a big beard, a baseball cap pulled down, and long brown hair. He greeted them and even smiled through his beard, asking if they needed a ride. Macy described him as charming, and even cute. Lily still says the moment he greeted her, her hackles went up. Despite her better judgment, my stepmum convinced her to get in the truck. She said it must only be a 10-minute drive down to the car, tops. The two girls opened the passenger's door to this rusty old thing, and the guy directed them behind the seat to get into the back. They settled in, and the truck started rumbling forwards. Lily always says that was the point it hit her, what a mistake they had just made. The back seat was clean enough, but there was a rope on the floor behind the driver's seat, and 4 boxes of saran wrap, half hanging out from under the passenger's seat. It seemed creepy and weird, but Lily didn't want to freak my stepmom out, so she just kept her mouth shut. After 10 minutes of driving, the woods didn't look any clearer, and they hadn't seen another car the whole time. Lily asked how long he thought it would be. He said he was taking a different route down the hill, and had to stop somewhere to get something first. The girls were 16 and 17, and Lily didn't want to press the issue. She was scared. She can remember his hair, because she was sitting behind him. He looked like a woodsy guy, but his hair was super tangled and dirty. She noticed crusted mud on his collar, and tried to find something identifiable about him, but just got more scared the more she picked up on little details. He was youngish, strong-looking, and had about a foot on both of them. So, they didn't ask any more questions, and he didn't offer any information, and they drove on. Several minutes after that, they reached a tiny shack, or a log cabin looking place, right there in the clearing of the trees. There was an old stump where someone had been chopping wood, and a huge axe stuck into the log. Lily was definitely on red alert now. The guy turned off the truck and slipped out of it saying, "I'll be right back. Don't get out." And he disappeared into the house. Lily started talking to my stepmum about how she was incredibly uncomfortable, but she mostly just dismissed it. Lily started begging, increasingly freaked out, and finally put her foot down, demanding that Macy exit the truck with her. So they got out and walked around the front of the vehicle. The house was around 50 yards in front of them. Why this guy would have left these 2 young girls in the truck alone while going into the house is beyond me. They wandered around, looking at it hesitantly. If this guy was really decent and just trying to give them a ride, it would be really rude to just run off, right? My stepmom had this strict upbringing when it came to manners and a public persona, and she saw it as an issue of that nature. So she actually started to head back to the truck, opening the front door to climb in behind the driver's seat. Lily was of course pissed off, and followed her to yell some more. That's when they noticed it. On the driver's side floor, half hidden under the seat, there was a big hatchet. It had dried, reddish-brown stains covering the blade and stuck to the floor under it. Lily understandably lost her shit at seeing it. My stepmom started getting hysterical. They decided that leaving was by far the best option at this point, and just booked it off the side of the property into the trees. They bumbled around in the trees for a little while, until Lily was fairly confident they were on their way back down the hill. My stepmom cried all the way down. Lily felt really bad about it, but was also completely freaked out that the guy would hear them, and so kept trying to calm her down. When they finally got back down to the bottom, and saw the old wooden fence that surrounded the original parking area, they were relieved. But, as they got closer, they saw it. The truck. It was parked on the other side of the gravelly makeshift lot, just sitting there, facing the other way innocently. They couldn't see if anyone was in it, and of course, Macy wanted to run for the car, but Lily was super hesitant. Lily managed to calm my stepmom down, saying she wanted to wait before running out into the open to see what was out there. Remember, this was taking place in the 1970s. No cell phones. There was no ranger station or anyone around. The parking lot was big, and empty, and open. And who knows what would have happened if they decided to stroll across it. Thankfully, Lily convinced my stepmom to chill, and the two of them hunkered down against a big tree, hidden by bushes and other trees, and waited it out for what seemed like a couple of hours, when dark started to fall. They were just planning their dash to their car, when they heard a clunk. Across the lot, they watched as one of the back doors to their car swung open. The bearded guy slid his way out of the back seat. He got out, shut the door, looked around at the surrounding woods for several moments, and then walked back to his truck. The truck lumbered past their car and out of sight. Several minutes after watching him drive away, they sprinted to their car as fast as they could, jumped in, and peeled out before they had even shut the doors. If this guy is still alive, he's really old. Thanks to this story that my stepmom told me, I always check my back seat before I get into my car. I've been reading stories on here for a while now, and I figured I'd post my own. I had to get my brother to help me recount this, as I was 12 at the time, and scared shitless as a result of what happened. This happened about 6 years ago. As stated, I was about 12, and my brother was 26 at the time. My brother had been serving in the US Army for several years when this happened, and was deploying in the Middle East on his second deployment if I remember correctly. Also of note was that he was a Green Beret, and had recently, 3 or 4 months prior to this trip, completed the Army Special Forces qualification course, Robin Sage and all that, and by then was an active duty SF engineer sergeant. Definitely not someone you'd want to fuck around with. Given that we both grew up with a passion for the outdoors, he thought it would be nice to take me on a backpacking trip in northern Alabama, the Sipsey Wilderness for those familiar with the area, before he left for 9 months. The trip had gone smoothly up until the third night when we were camping out. Around 8 PM, we had our tent set up, had eaten dinner, and were sitting by the fire talking about typical boy shit, guns, girls, etc. For some reference, our spot was about 50 yards from a large stream, and about 50 yards downhill adjacent to a large path. Our camp, the stream and the path, formed a triangle of sorts. This was summertime in Alabama, so it wasn't quite dark yet, when 2 guys, who looked to be in their late 20s, wandered up and asked if we had seen any hogs while we were hiking around. Given that this is rural Alabama, we actually had seen some further into the wilderness area and told them so. Even though they were relatively polite, my brother called them good old boys, I got a seriously creepy vibe from them. Dirty clothes, greasy hair, scraggly facial hair, etc. I think they looked like they belonged in the movie Deliverance. They kinda hung out for a few minutes, maybe a little longer than they should have, looking around, asking us questions like how long we'd been out there, how long we were staying, and it looked like they were kind of sizing us up. They then abruptly said goodbye and walked away. I didn't necessarily feel threatened by them, and I know for sure my brother didn't, but I still felt uneasy about the whole thing. Fast forward 3 or 4 hours. My brother and I had gone to sleep and were nestling into our tent when I woke up to the sound of multiple dogs barking. I've always been a heavy sleeper, and they sounded like they were only about 100 yards away or so. My heart immediately started pounding, and I kicked my brother through my sleeping bag and asked if he was awake or if he'd heard the dogs. He responded, "I'm awake. They've been getting closer for the past hour or so. Just lay still and don't make any sounds." Needless to say, 12-year-old me was about to shit my pants. We would also hear sporadic shouts from several different sources, but neither came any closer. A few minutes later, my brother whispered, "They're just hunting for hogs. They use the dogs to pin them down and then they shoot them." This gave me some relief, but not much. Somehow, I managed to fall back asleep. The fact that they were doing this late at night was a huge red flag, my brother later told me, but I think at the time, he was just trying to keep me calm. Fast forward what was probably another 3 hours, around 2 AM. I'd managed to sleep pretty well after first hearing the hog hunters, when I woke up to my brother squeezing my shoulder firmly, saying, "Wake up, put your shoes on quickly, and follow me. Be as quiet as you can." My heart immediately went back to racing, because I heard the dogs and the voices in the distance, farther away than before, but still distinct. Not asking any questions, I did what he said, and as soon as we were out of the tent, he told me to get on his back. We snuck about 50 yards into the woods, towards the junction of the path and the stream, and crawled into some bushes. It was up a hill, so we had a pretty good elevated view of our campsite. I remember, as we were laying there, how loudly I was breathing, and how quiet he was, when I heard the very distinct sound of a pistol slide racking. I looked over, and my brother had a pistol, a HK USP that he gave to me a few years after this story took place. He was watching the campsite and the surrounding area. I started to whisper to him, when he put his hand over my mouth and pointed at the campsite. The group of hunters had steadily approached our campsite, and by this time, 30 minutes or so, had reached it. There were 5 of them, and about 3 or 4 dogs. They all looked relatively young, but 2 had either rifles or shotguns, and the dogs were going crazy, obviously having smelled our scent. For those of you who are backpackers or campers, nobody who comes up on a random camp in the middle of the night with dogs and guns has good intentions. I knew this, and my brother knew this. I was scared shitless. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but my brother later told me that they were talking about us, although he hadn't heard any specifics either. They lingered for about 20 minutes, shining flashlights around and talking to themselves, when my brother put his mouth to my ear and said, "If they come towards us, I want you to turn and run as quickly as you can. Don't stop, don't look back. Stay off the trail and look for the flashing lights." I didn't know what he meant by the flashing lights, but I'll get to that later. I knew I could make it back, because he had taught me LAN nav pretty well. He then handed me a flashlight and told me not to take the red filter off. He later told me that the red filter helps preserve night vision and cuts down ambient light, so it would be harder for someone to see me from a distance. At this point I was so scared I almost started crying, but at the same time I had a rush of adrenaline and what I think now was confidence that he thought I could handle myself. We laid there for a while longer, when, out of nowhere, they started screaming, "Where are you at?" and started firing into the woods at random. My brother dragged me back behind the crest of a hill and threw himself on top of me. Thankfully, from our position on top of the hill, we were protected from any gunfire. They shot maybe 5 or 6 more times, and then started walking back the direction they came from. They got maybe 100 yards away, when I heard a blaring siren and saw emergency lights flashing through the woods. Turns out, my brother had called the Forest Service office on a satellite phone he had. He did this while I was asleep, and they had sent out a Forest Service officer and game wardens to our area of the wilderness. The Sipsey Wilderness is about 25,000 acres in size, so it took them a while to get there on the dirt roads. When we saw the game warden's truck, my brother signalled them over with the light and pointed them in the direction the hunters had gone, and the guy sped off, shining his spotlight through the woods. As soon as we were sure they were all gone, we went back to our camp, packed up our shit, and waited by the path for the game warden to come back. The game warden gave us a ride in his truck bed, back to the main staging area. On the ride back, my brother told me how brave I'd been, and that we would talk about it with our parents the next day if I wanted to. I asked him not to do that, because I thought they might never let me go hiking again. We never got any definitive information on what happened to the rednecks we encountered. I have many friends who have gone out to the Sipsey area and had a great time with no creepy stuff going on. However, it truly is a wilderness, and law enforcement response, if you can even reach them, would be slow. I was lucky that my brother was there and reacted so quickly. Otherwise, who knows what could have happened. Me and a buddy chose to go backpacking in some national forest in Oregon, specifically for how remote it was. About a year prior, a family became lost in that forest, and the father was never found, although the mother and child lived to tell the tale. Anyway, we set up camp around 4 PM, after getting pretty deep into the woods on a mountain accessed by logging roads, maybe about 100 or 200 yards from where we parked, near a lake. Without much else to do, we started a fire and cracked some beers as the sun went down. Then, some pickup trucks started going through the woods, slowing down when they saw our campfire. We got curious and stupid because of the beers, and went deeper into the woods. Seemed like a hell of a party was going on. Then we stumbled into a clearing, where maybe 15 or 20 dudes were hanging around a bonfire, next to a mossy, run-down camper trailer. One had a pistol on his hip. Another was just chilling with a shotgun. We're thinking oh shit at first, but then one of them approaches us, and acts neighbourly and invites us to have a beer, so it seemed okay. They were joking around mostly, some talking about drugs, coke, meth, but then there were some older dudes that seemed pretty tense. As this happened, 4 or 5 dudes who seemed to be standing sentry at the camper went inside for a few minutes. This camper didn't look like it had been moved in a very long time. When they came back out, they said we were faggots and saw us making out. Pretty quickly I got up to head back to our site, but my slower, drunker buddy took a few punches. Then he made it out and started following, and we were sprinting through the forest in the darkness, just hoping to get back to our site by spotting the glowing embers of our burnt-out fire, all the while being chased by gun-toting nuts. We found our site, and with pretty much everything still in the tent, we pulled the stakes to toss it in the trunk of our car. Then we hear an enraged scream coming from about 50 yards behind us. Something along the lines of, "Kill the faggots." So we were like, fuck it, dropped the tent and gear without even saying a word to each other, and sprinted in the direction of our car. We peeled out and thought we were good, but about 30 seconds later, some headlights come up from behind us, and I'm thinking, fuck, that's the truck that Shotgun Dude was chilling at. So now we're being pursued by crazy gun-toting rednecks with a superior vehicle in unfamiliar forest on unmaintained logging roads in the dark, and the only thing we can do is speed up. I remember looking at the speedometer as we approached a washed-out hairpin turn, and it was moving from 45 to 50 miles an hour, and the truck was tailing us pretty close, like only a couple of feet behind us. I was pretty sure that we were going to slide off that cliff and die. Somehow, my drunk-ass buddy managed to make the turn and get some distance between us and the tweakers, and we eventually made it onto a paved 2-lane, at which point the truck pulled off. We put it together later that camper van had to be a meth lab. There's nothing else it really could have been. Deep in the forest with armed guards, and looking like it hadn't been moved for years. So in essence, this whole event resulted in a drunken high-speed chase at night on unfamiliar logging roads, and we nearly slid off the side of that mountain. About 3 weeks ago, my mum told my brother and I this story. Sally is a lifelong family friend. She would frequently visit her friends and family in Oklahoma. We live in a small town in southern Ontario, Canada. So, Sally would drive. Sally would drive straight 20 hours at least overnight to get from our town to another small town. She did this to save money, and obviously she wanted to arrive as soon as possible. Now that you've heard the prelude, here's the story. About 30 years ago, she decided to head south for a visit. No big deal, she's done this a few times now. So, she packs up and heads out. At some point, after driving about 14 or 15 hours, she started getting pretty tired. Being as it was probably the 80s, it was a little safer. So, she decided that she would stop at a rest stop for the night to get some sleep, and resume again first thing in the AM. She parks in a very well lit and busy rest stop. She parks right by the lights, and felt at ease because there was an abundance of travellers stopping and going. She gets out of her car for a bathroom break, comes back, and settles in her car. About then, an RV pulls up beside her, and an elderly couple get out. The man asks her about coming from Canada. They strike up a little conversation. Nothing odd. The couple just talk to Sally for a little bit. They tell her that they're driving from the south, going north, and they just needed to have a sleep for the night. They wanted to talk because they were unsure if the rest stop was okay to stop at, but seeing as Sally was there, they felt at ease. They say good night and good trip, and the couple head back to their RV. Sally locked her doors up and went to sleep. 2 or 3 hours later, Sally woke up with a really unsettling feeling. She looks around. Nothing. A few people going in the stop. Parking lights are all on. She assumes she's just feeling bad because she's tired and her car isn't the best place to sleep in. After 10 minutes, she actually said that this feeling got worse, and it was a jarring, queasy, uneasy feeling. She sits back and tries to shrug it off. This doesn't work, and apparently she had every red alarm and instinct telling her that she needed to go. She panics, starts her car and peels off. She doesn't care where, she just knew that she needed to get away from there. About 20 miles down the road, she finds a motel and gas station. She decides to see if she could get a room there for what little money she had. She converses with the person in charge. He cuts her a deal because he doesn't want to see a young woman driving alone late at night. She gets a key, pops in her hotel room, and sleeps for the night. No issues whatsoever. Around 9 AM, she wakes up, showers, changes clothes, and decides to relax for a few. She turns on the TV, and what she said was on it actually gave me chills. There was a breaking news story about an elderly couple who had been killed in the middle of the night. The news shows the RV that Sally was parked next to, in the exact same spot, at the exact same stop. She even sees the fast food drink cup that she dropped by accident that rolled under her car. Sometime during the night, a man broke into their RV and killed them, and then simply left. Presumably this all happened right before Sally had left. The man was never caught, and Sally, since then, stopped at hotels for the night and avoided rest stops. This encounter takes place several years ago, in a remote part of the Australian outback. For a bit of background, I'm a pretty built 6'2" dude, and I was around 26 years old at the time. I was on a road trip with a mate. travelling around the central Queensland outback in my old, semi-reliable Nissan X-Trail. We're both massive science zoology nerds, and had heard about this amazing dinosaur trail out this way, which is basically a grouping of 3 areas, Winton, Richmond, and Hughenden, that have had previous dino bone discoveries, still have fossils, as well as a seriously awesome dinosaur track with preserved foot imprints. We were staying at a place 3 hours from Winton for a couple of days, and were pretty keen to check out this trail. So, we made the decision to do the 6-hour round trip in a day. We were pretty ambitious and stupid back then. We left at 9 AM the next morning, car packed with lunch, several litres of water, and my trusty GPS, and off we went. It was a long drive, and halfway through, my aircon decided to cark it. If any of you live in or have visited Australia in the summer, you would know that it's brutally hot. So I'm sure you can imagine the 3-hour trip without aircon was hell. To make matters worse, my GPS also stopped working, as the map software didn't recognise the area we were in. Luckily, I had an old Refidex in my back seat, but it was pretty tough to revert back to map reading when you're so used to a computer screen telling you where to go. Especially given we're talking about the Australian outback here, complete with dirt tracks for roads and very limited signage. But I digress. Finally, we make it to the trail, and kick around there for a couple of hours. Not gonna lie, it was pretty awesome. Then we decided to make the trip back, as it was starting to get later in the afternoon, and we didn't want to drive back in the dark. As we were about to leave, this gnarly old guy, who appeared to be an employee of the trail company, dressed in all khaki camouflage gear, asked us about where we were from and where we were heading. He gave me the stink eye when I was vague with details, but my mate told him the name of the town we were staying at. He took a real liking to my mate, and he laughed when he told him about our lengthy journey. Apparently we had taken the long route, and there was a much quicker way back that would shave about an hour off our trip. We jumped at the directions he gave us, which were all verbal, and we wrote them down. Off we went on our merry way, thinking how lucky we were that we met this old dude, who gave us some sweet intel on a shortcut home. But I can't deny, there was a definite creepy vibe coming off him. Based on the directions he gave us, we went winding along several roads in an area I'd never been in, and eventually settled straight back on a narrow dirt road. We were supposed to reach an intersection after about half an hour of driving, take a right and continue on that road until we got to a main highway that would take us back. After about an hour and a half of driving on this dirt trail though, we still hadn't reached the intersection. I was starting to freak out a bit, thinking we'd missed the turn, but my mate was completely chilled out, and was sure that we'd get there eventually. I think he thought I was driving too slowly, but there are kangaroos out there, and they're dangerous if you hit one. We'd been travelling for quite a while now, and it was getting later and later in the day, and it got to the point where the petrol in the tank was only a quarter full. There were no houses, other roads or cars in sight, and I was really not comfortable with where this was headed. The middle of nowhere, in a remote area, in the wasteland that is the Australian outback. There weren't any trees, only this dirt road, and desolate, dry bushland as far as the eye can see. I stopped the car and told my mate to get the binoculars out of the back, to take a look around in case there was any landmarks. Yes, I carried binoculars in my car, and I still do. He obliges, and I can just make out a house-like structure not too far in the distance, so we made the decision to head for that. We figured it could be a house, and maybe the people would be nice enough to give us some petrol to top us up, and some better directions to get us out of there. As we neared this structure, it became apparent that this was no house at all. We pulled up out front, and see that it's an old caravan that's been burned to a shell from the inside out. It's still got 3 blackened partial walls up though, so we can't see all the way in, and it looks like someone's been there recently, because there are animal bones strung up all over the place, and a cow skull at the entrance of the caravan. Some of the animal bone things even have grass or horsehair woven into them, and they're arranged like decorations. Then we see this hand-painted sign that's been staked into the ground, with the words, Moonlight Motel, written on it. My alarm bells are ringing loud and clear. I nudge my friend and say, let's get the fuck out of here. But he's distracted by something in the distance. It's a car, coming in the direction we'd just come from. It must have only been 10 minutes behind us the entire time we were driving, but I didn't see it once. It's kicking up a ton of dust, which indicates that it's coming towards us fast. It's at this point we both hear a creepy scratching sound coming from the burned out caravan, like someone scratching at the wall from the inside. I move a little closer to try and see what it is. And there is a person in there, peeking out at us from a hole in the damaged wall. Then, this childlike voice, that's obviously a grown man imitating a little girl, giggles and says, "Are you here to play with me?" My mate and I both look at each other, and we book it out of there, back into the inner sanctum of the X-Trail. Just as I'm about to reverse out, the other car stops just behind my car, with the high beams on. I can't see the driver, but they're in my way, so I can't reverse out of there. I have no choice but to drive forward and turn around that way, narrowly missing the state motel sign. As we're turning to leave, the driver starts to blare the horn, just hammering it for no reason at all. I just sped off back in the direction that we came, and thankfully the other car doesn't follow. It's getting to twilight at this stage, and pretty dangerous to be out on these country roads once it's dark, because of the aforementioned kangaroo situation. But we're feeling a bit better, as we manage to navigate our way back to where we came from, the Dino Trail, and even start to joke around about what happened. The person in the other car was probably just honking at us to get our attention to help with directions or something. I pull into the parking lot and go to the front desk area of the company that runs the tours. I explained that we had gotten lost on the way back to the town we were staying at, and the lady there was kind enough to give us just enough petrol for the ride back. I couldn't help myself, and I mentioned to her that our workmate was a real jerk for giving us those weird directions. We figured there was no way that we could have messed up with the directions that he gave us. At this point, she gives me a weird look, and asked if I could describe him. So I describe him, and her face goes funny, and she says, "That man doesn't work here. I saw him talking with the tourists today, and my boss had to ask him to leave. He kept trying to get the details of where people were staying, and telling them that he had vacancies at his place, and they could stay there, the Moonlight Motel." So, to the creepy old dude, who was pretending to give helpful directions to a couple of city folk to trap and potentially murder them in your lovely accommodation, let's not meet. My dad is a journalist and non-fiction writer, but at the time of this incident, he was a reporter for the Virginia Pilot, based out of Virginia. He was working on a new book titled The Big Roads when this occurred. We often went on road trips for his research needs, and once his proposal for his new book was accepted, we went on a cross-country road trip from Virginia to California, and back on old Route 66 for the book. Me, being 13 at the time, demanded he let me bring a friend along, and so there was 3 of us. The first quarter of our month-long adventure went off without a hitch. We either stayed in motels, with the occasional stay at a grand old historic hotel. My dad, being the outdoorsman that he was, decided that we should camp about 5 or 6 times throughout our trip. The first night we camped, we were in the middle of literally nowhere. No one for at least 20 miles on either side, in the middle of the Utah desert. When we arrived at our campsite in our rented minivan, my dad wanted to explore a bit, because at the bottom of the hill that our campsite was situated on was an old pony express stop. On account of all the bees and wasps, my friend decided to stay in the minivan until my dad and I had finished checking out the pony express stop and set up camp. We were utterly alone, and as a rather jumpy and skittish 13-year-old, it became apparent that we were isolated to the point that, if anything happened, we'd be totally screwed. That's all I could think about as my dad and I walked down the hill to explore. We checked out the old station, and everything was going smoothly, until we were about halfway back up the hill. A large truck that we had noticed driving down an old dirt road a few minutes before had turned into the campsite. We were surprised, but really didn't think anything of it. Maybe this guy was on an adventure too. The truck parked halfway up the road, and a man got out. He had what I think was a hunting rifle, and started hunting around the area my dad and I were in, about 50 feet from our campsite. Of course, this was an absolute no hunting zone, and my dad became a bit concerned, because my friend was closer to the stranger than she was to us. He yelled out to the man, saying that there were children around, and he couldn't hunt there. As soon as the man turned to face us, I got an overwhelming sense of complete doom. I felt in my entire body that something wasn't right. The man looked us over, and without saying a word, aimed his gun at us. My dad doesn't carry a gun, a knife, or any kind of weapon. I felt completely trapped. My dad ushered me behind a large boulder, but he didn't hide. He stood his ground. There was a solid minute of this man aiming his gun at my dad, and my dad standing completely still, staring back. In my mind, I considered all the ways this could go down. I was absolutely terrified that this guy would shoot my dad, and somehow my friend, and I would have to escape or get murdered during this tense minute. The guy lowered his gun, cocked his head to the side, and pointed at my dad, with his fingers in the shape of a pistol, and fake shot him. Then he simply got into his truck and drove away. That night, my friend and I slept in the minivan in 90-degree heat, because I was positive this guy would come back and murder us all. Thankfully, he didn't come back. This happened to me about 2 years ago, when I was on a cross-country road trip with my good friend, Kim. We started in the northwest, and our final destination was in Georgia. We were trying to make this trip as quickly as possible, and since it was just the two of us, we took shifts, sleeping and driving. We had just passed through Laramie, Wyoming, where I got pulled over for speeding. It wasn't anything major, only 10 miles over the speed limit. I apologized to the officer, and he kindly let us off the hook, since our car had no cruise control, and we had a long way to go. After leaving Laramie, we didn't stop for a long time, and the highway rarely cut through any towns. It was probably 3 or 4 in the morning, and the highway was deserted. Tall pines lined the 2-lane blacktop, and jagged mountains framed the starlit sky above. Kim was sleeping heavily, her chair reclined all the way down, a blanket thrown over her head. I had the radio on, but she was so exhausted she didn't even stir. I was trying to concentrate on the road and the quiet music on the radio to stay awake. Visibility was very limited. There were no lights on this road. Suddenly, red and blue lights flashed in my rearview mirror. I hastily looked at my speedometer, but I was diligently following the speed limit after my narrow escape from getting a ticket before. I pulled over, killed my engine, and rolled down the window. The cop car behind me appeared to be an unmarked vehicle, but it was hard to tell. Kim didn't stir as the police officer approached my window. "Ma'am," he said in a Midwestern drawl, "do you know why I pulled you over today?" "No, officer, I don't," I replied. His flashlight was pointing directly at my face, and I had to avert my eyes. I looked at the badge on his chest instead of his face. "Your plates sure are from far away. Where are you headed?" The police officer in Laramie had asked the same thing. "Georgia, family emergency." "Is that so? Well, miss, you aren't in any shape to make it to Georgia from Nebraska. No siree." I frowned. Was my car breaking down? Tail lights out? In my tired haze, had I missed something vital? So I asked him, "I'm sorry, what's wrong?" "Here, miss. Step out of the car. I can show you." He gestured with his flashlight, and the beam slanted across Kim's blanketed, shrouded face, and she sat up. She yawned and asked what was going on. The police officer abruptly turned, walked away and got into his car. He flipped a U-turn and sped off in the opposite direction down the highway. Kim and I stared at each other for a moment, before I started the car, rolled up the window and sped off, with no regard for the speed limit this time. Don't stop for unmarked police cars 300 miles from civilization.